listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Good morning, everybody. Jamarl, how are you doing this morning?
Not great this morning. Everything is pretty much going wrong.
That's no good.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that. Let's get it fixed and figured out. Anyway, with that, I'm doing okay overall, but it's just past 7 a.m. Eastern, folks. It is November 9th. And it's time now for headlines. First up in COVID news. Yesterday in the United States, there were 126,461 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,222 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 73,875 cases per day. That's an increase of 5% from the average 2 weeks ago. 58% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 67% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 46,575,792 people across the United States and killed 755,273 people across the U.S. In Russia, deaths from the novel coronavirus have reached a daily record of 1,211 in a single day. That is the country's highest death toll yet in the pandemic. It also saw 39,160 new cases. Granted, in terms of the cases, that's a fraction of what we're seeing in the U.S. On a per capita basis. In terms of the deaths, that's higher than we're seeing in the U.S. I'm sorry to hear that Russia's having a hard time with that right now, but I want to come back to us, too, for a second. We're also seeing an increase in cases for the first time in a little while. Cases have been continuously decreasing for months there, basically, and they flatlined for like literally a day yesterday, and now they're going back up.
Yesterday was Monday.
Yesterday was Monday, but now they're going back up.
Yeah, no, but on Mondays, the numbers
they're always low.
Ridiculously low, yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. No, I hear you. In national news, the Justice Department yesterday argued that the federal government had the authority to mandate that employers require that employees be vaccinated. This came in the form of a 28-page filing before the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which last week blocked the vaccine mandate with a nationwide stay. And with that, we're going to close out our first brief batch of headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Things have been slightly sorted, right, Jamarl?
Yeah.
At the very least, slightly.
Yeah.
Good to hear. Possible role of illegal drugs in the Astroworld fiasco where, 8 people died and dozens more were injured, but also toxicology, illegal drugs. That's pretty common at music festivals. People are taking drugs all the time. So I don't know exactly what that would show them. Maybe I'm misunderstanding slightly, but another side of this.
A music festival?
The Astroworld. Remember we were talking about the Travis Scott concert, and Drake was there too, but it was really all about Travis Scott. He was performing.
Yeah, they're suing him over that, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought they were looking into criminal charges potentially over it also.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't necessarily know what he's culpable for in this. Or if he's culpable for anything, or if it was just somewhat of a mistake. But apparently they did give him a heads up that they were overcrowded or they were overbooked or something to that effect. And so at the point where you're like spitting rhymes, people are being stampeded, and you continue to spit rhymes like, I am so dedicated to my task that I'm just going to stay here and just rap. That looks kind of bad, but I don't necessarily know if there's criminal negligence associated with it. But I mean, at the point where you have, 8 people dead or 4 people dead or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not, if you're their parents, you're not going to take that comfort of, well, it was a mistake. You're not going to think that way.
No, not at all.
My child died as a result of your malfeasance. That's the way it's going to be looked at.
No, I'm sure the parents are going to be happy to see whatever they can get out of Travis Scott. Or it's not even that, because that's a cynical way to look at it. But they're going to want something.
They want a pound of flesh.
Yeah, I hear you. But then Travis Scott, I'm obviously familiar with the guy, big name in music. Hadn't really listened to his music, wasn't too familiar with him. But it seems like he's kind of made his thing by having this sort of raucous, high energy style events, like these kinds of events. That's his kind of thing. I don't know. My point is it makes sense that the crowd would react that way, potentially. Not stampeding and killing each other, but being energetic and maybe a little bit overboard. You know what I mean? And that can get
But they had a
dangerous.
mosh pit.
They had a mosh pit, yeah.
I mean, that gives you the impression of, the level of energy that's associated with it. Like, he's not doing a ballad, and people are just kind of, moshing out.
Oh, no.
Like in, like The Watchmen, when they're doing Unforgettable while dude is getting beat to death through Unforgettable. It's not like that cross thing. No, it's probably high energy. The people were probably excited.
Yep.
What do they know what spooked the crowd in the first place for the stampede to take place?
I'm not sure. No, I don't know about that one. My understanding is that it wasn't something that spooked people so much as it was a sort of a rush to the stage. Things get pressed in, you know what I mean? And you just get trampled. People start falling. You don't have enough room to breathe, literally. I've been not anywhere nearly that bad, but you've had tastes of it. I've had tastes of it specifically at protests and things like that, where you have crowds of people that are pushing, you know what I mean? And it screws with you.
Wow.
But Cordell's saying that he thinks Travis Scott couldn't see what was going on while this was happening.
Well, that's possible.
Potentially in his
question,
defense.
Because that was the question yesterday. It was like, okay, well, how much do you know? I mean, if what was taking place wasn't necessarily entirely near the stage, he may not see it. He might just be out there hearing the commotion. And that's assuming he's even hearing the commotion. But yeah, either way, I'm kind of curious on, I don't know, the developments of that one.
Can I turn to something else too?
Go for it.
So this is, in the last couple of days, has to do with the John Durham investigation, Steele dossier. This is an article over in the Daily Caller, and it's just characteristic of the kind of thing that, sadly, I think we can expect to see as this next beat of the Russiagate story rolls on. Because Russiagate, although it appears to be dead, there's still a heartbeat or something to it, apparently. Over in the Daily Caller, here's the title of the article. Steele was being used by the Russians, quote unquote. Trump dossier critics see their suspicions verified with Danchenko indictment. This is a Daily Caller, right-leaning outlet, of course. And they are doing the thing that the right has done pretty consistently as Russiagate has rolled on, which is also blaming it on the Russians.
Yeah.
Also trying to pin this one on the Russians because Igor Danchenko is a Russian citizen, even though he worked for the Brookings Institution, even though he was with that outlet. That's not a pro-Russian outlet if you look at it. Even though, looking at him at a sort of surface appraisal, you could see, okay, this guy broadly is going to be on the other side of the camp from the Russians just because he's a Russian citizen. I don't know. There's this weird racism about it where it's like, it's like reviving those sort of McCarthyite sentiments of, just because somebody has this link to this outside nation, we need to assume that they're allied with them, even though if you look at what the guy stands for, very clearly he's opposed to them. I don't know. Yeah. And it's this willingness to go along with it just because you want to make it against Russia. Diana Glebova, who's the person who wrote this article, I don't know. My concern is that, and I know my dad knows this too, we've done the research on this together, on the right, there are strong neocon elements, think tanks, media centers, institutes to get the idea across that will very consistently try to make Russia the enemy and try to make Iran the enemy and try to make China the enemy. Just try to play up the whole American dynamic where we have these quote unquote authoritarian countries that we're going against, despite the fact that we're leading pretty authoritarian ourselves. Anyway, it's sad to see this story coming out in the Daily Caller, but again, I don't know if it's a surprise.
No, it's not too much of a surprise. I mean, it really does seem like Intel or intelligence services, or for that matter, the political wings, have I don't know what you want to call it. It's not racist is not the right word for it, but there's a feel of that associated with it in the way that they would basically, blackball all of that stuff. I mean, it's very weird. I mean, if you remember when Sanders was running against Clinton, they tried to say that the Russians were controlling the environmentalist movement, that they were controlling Black Lives Matter. And it's like, so wait, it's not the fact that they're shot by cops. It has everything to do with the Russians influencing them. It's the weirdest thing ever. It's almost like we don't expect people to have agency. We just want to use whatever we could as a club to hit whoever your political opponent is.
And remember, the Internet Research Agency? That outlet, blaming a lot of that stuff on them in the 2016 cycle. And
I remember that. They were basically a troll farm or something. Not a troll farm. They were
a St. Petersburg-based quote-unquote troll farm that, I mean, who knows exactly what they did.
Well, they were just trying to get money. I mean,
that's the thing.
Yeah, it was like a private business. It was like...
they were doing all these different political ads.
Right, during the political season.
Yeah, but also non-political ads, just like community, ads that will get people's attention, again, to make money, not necessarily to serve some geopolitical end.
Yeah, it was only a few of them that were political ads. I mean, the wild part about it is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, their job was basically to put out clickable links and tweets and stuff.
Yeah.
And, the operative question is, okay, well, if these guys, if they were trying to make money, and you were during the military, or not during the military, during a political climate, during an election, would you put out content or bait that would allow the person to click that's pertaining to the election. Well, of course.
Yeah.
We do that when we're talking about politics or whatever, and it's whatever is pretty much on the political marquee for the moment to talk about. That would be no different for them.
You mean put, like the title for our show, that
right.
kind of thing?
Exactly. Like if, for example, if the debt ceiling is taking place tomorrow, well, we'll be talking about the debt ceiling because that's directly related to the news that's on the marquee.
Well, and for them, it's just that's what's in the news cycle. That's what people are talking about, and therefore they know that people are sort of paying attention to that.
Right there.
And that
they have a high propensity to click.
Oh, yeah, maybe I can learn something about this. Or, oh, yeah, I heard about that, and they'll click through onto it. Another side of this that's interesting to me is the argument back then was that the IRA, Internet Research Agency, not Irish Republican Army, but the IRA, was intentionally trying to disrupt American democracy, right? Destabilize American democracy by sowing dissent through supporting all these. What'd you say?
They called it Pearl Harbor.
Oh, God, what an exaggeration.
Yeah.
But here's where I was going. That was the narrative back in 2016, 2017. Skip to 2020, Black Lives Matter, which the Democrats have doubled down on. I'm supportive in some ways of a lot of Black Lives Matter, but it seems pretty clear to me that caused dissent in the country, that destabilized the country. But by and large, the Democrats who were pushing Russiagate were entirely for it. Do you see what I'm saying? Back in 2016, 2017, they were hitting the Russians and the IRA for doing this thing that they themselves were perfectly happy to do. And I'm not even judging them necessarily for doing it right now. I'm just saying it's hypocritical. Back in 2016, 2017, they were hitting these other people, and then they did the exact same thing, even more so, very intentionally. Do you see what I'm saying there? Does it make sense?
Don't get that one.
They were accusing the Internet Research Agency back in 2016, 2017. This is the whole narrative of sowing dissent.
Right. They were trying to undermine American democracy, et cetera, et
now,
cetera.
Republicans would argue that Democrats were sowing dissent back in 2020 with BLM. Intentionally or not, whatever. And I'm not trying to cast aspersions on the BLM movement. What I'm saying is they were very clearly, that was like a destabilizing movement. Not that that's a bad thing. You want to sort of shake things up. I get why people who are pushing for BLM want to do that. My point is, it's very clearly destabilizing, and they were all for it. They don't care about it. It was just that the Russians, not even the Russian government, but that Russians in Russia had some, relationship with us. You see what I'm saying? It was about the Russia aspect, not about what they were doing.
Yeah. No, I see what you mean. I think you're trying to make a one-to-one, or at the very least a close link between one political movement that might have destabilized the country, or at the very least created created conflict, versus, I guess, what they're trying to say the Internet Research Agency is trying to do. I mean, I do think there's a difference between if they were legit, meaning if they were correct, and if this stuff wasn't conspiracy theory. I do think there's a difference between a foreign actor doing something versus things that are taking place internally in the country that creates this kind of back and forth.
True.
But I get your point, though. I know what you're trying to say, that basically these guys were perfectly willing to be okay with division when it was suited their interests.
And that's where I would go. The narrative they would make, the narrative they were making in 2016, 2017 is America is a divided country and the Russians are trying to make us more divided, right?
Yeah.
And then 2020, they're perfectly willing to divide Americans. And I'm not saying, again, you can argue for a good reason, but it's going to divide Americans when you get into a BLM thing. They're willing to do that themselves. And I get your argument. It's more legitimate for a domestic political force by far to do that than an international one. And domestically, we'll push back against that. My point is, they didn't actually care about the destabilization or the instability. They were willing to do that themselves when it suited them.
Yeah, for political gain.
It was just a rhetorical argument to hit the Russians. And not even the Russian government, but random Russians that they could associate, they could try to tie to the Russian government just to do the thing they're doing, which is get Putin out of power.
To be honest, I mean, it wasn't even like they backed the movement per se. Like the Black Lives Matter stuff, like it wasn't like they passed policy to do anything about it or to deal with the police brutality or deal with the poverty they didn't do any of that stuff. I mean, they basically used it for rhetorical flourish. And so you'd have Biden leaning on the coffin and saying, I'm here for this what's his name? Yeah, I'm here for this guy.
Yeah.
And, they would change the name to Black Lives Matter Boulevard while simultaneously basically increasing the cost or increasing the budget for police departments. I mean, it did come across as a political touchstone, as opposed to we deeply believe these things, and so we're going to get rid of qualified immunity, or we're going to, do something about the police. Yeah, it just seems like it was a political touchstone.
And also, Black Lives Matter Boulevard, just on that briefly for a second, Jack and I were walking down the other day, and it's built into it, and maybe technically I remembered this when it was put into place last year, but you literally, it's like you have a hard time reading it when you're on the ground. In some sense, and I don't know if this is actually a point, but it's kind of elitist in a weird way. It's built for helicopters to fly over and read. It's not built for anybody living in the city to be like, okay, this is what this represents. It's not like there are visible murals commemorating what happened or what the movement was about. It's a single string of letters visible only from above.
Yeah.
What's the point of it? It's just PR optics. It's not supposed to commemorate anything or celebrate anything. And I'm not going to try to hit anybody. I'm just saying there's an element there.
I mean, but they know what it is. I mean, it's not like, what is it called, Nazca lines or something like that, where you're flying in space. You're like, oh, wow, look at that thing down there.
I hear you.
They at the very least know.
You can figure it out. But my point is, I had to be like, okay, what word is this? And then I took 10 seconds walking 50 feet to be like, okay, that's matter. I could have figured that out maybe, but like, okay, that's matter. There must be black and lives somewhere further up the boulevard. Yeah. My point is, it's inaccessible and I don't know.
Well, I do feel you in the sense that it feels like they're not serious about it. Like it feels like it's a political touchstone, not necessarily something like they're like deeply passionate and bothered by. You know what I mean? It does come across that way, where it just seems like they're using it for political gamesmanship.
Yeah, and I kind of have mixed feelings about how last summer went with BLM, because it got kind of intense in some ways, and I feel like that set the whole like push for true equality, both political and economic, for black people in America. I feel like some of that stuff got pushed back by some of the excesses last year, but of course I also agree with some of the sentiments and all that. So I mean, I don't know. I'm coming to it with a kind of ambiguous moral perspective, which is why you hear me like, I don't know exactly how I feel about it. My point is, even if I take the best faith interpretation of it, it doesn't seem like our leaders in this country, the Democrats specifically, actually are going to stand by it when it comes down to it. And it doesn't seem like they actually care about it. It seems like a useful political touchstone football for them to bring up when they see somebody waiting for a pass or whatever.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's probably more right, that it is somewhat of a political touchstone.
I hear you.
I mean, honestly, I think a lot of the stuff is kind of, what's the fastest thing moving to help you and whatever aim you're trying to get. And when Donald Trump was in office, it was beneficial to basically use the thing, oh, he's racist, he's misogynistic, he's bigoted, et cetera, et cetera. And you can, on some level, castigate many of his supporters and everything associated with it. And from the standpoint of Black Lives Matter, where you had George Floyd die, and you had the public tweak their perspective for once, where the public was like, okay, that was not good. 9 minutes on somebody's throat. We frowned upon that. Well, at the point, Democrats jumped on board with it. Again, not literally. And I think even at the time, I kept making the point of saying, these guys are not hitting at the real issue here, which is the economics underlying a lot of the stuff. I mean, you could even look at the areas that the killings were taking place. I mean, in one of those areas, I believe the one that was in, I think it was Wisconsin, if I'm not mistaken. The black neighborhoods there were jails, were, these places that were just in complete disrepute. And yet, that wasn't the thing that came up for the conversation. They wanted to basically make it look as if it's all on cops. So we're just going to focus on cops. When the reality is, if you're going to do anything about that, you're going to have to deal with the poverty on some level. That was, meaning they had no real interest in getting to the real nub of it. They wanted the political effect of it, which is what they basically did. And, it's not like they passed any major legislation on crime or criminal justice or anything like that. So, yeah, I mean, I totally get where you're coming from the standpoint of them using basically politics for their own political expedience. But the Russian thing just always comes up. It seems like it comes across as, like I said, racist on some level, where it's the thing that you can throw into the mix and you just kind of almost assume that people would accept some legitimacy to it, regardless of what it is. Doesn't matter what it is at all. And it's like you just add the Russian part to it, and it's like, oh, there's a black mark associated with the thing that I'm accusing whatever of.
Yeah.
Both sides of the party do that. It was less prevalent when Trump was in office, only because it was after Trump, meaning they were going after Trump with it, so he's less inclined to kind of fall into it. But both parties.
But even then, I saw Republicans doing it. Trump wasn't, but I saw plenty of Republicans doing it. I remember that. Let's take it out.
Yeah.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be going into our monologue, Jamarl's monologue, his soapbox segment, usually followed by a short back and forth. We'll be right back on the other side of the short break.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the D.C. area, or for that matter, if you're hanging out in the D.C. area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Let's talk about Rachel Maddow. Peter Strzok basically went on Rachel Maddow, I think this was a few days ago, and basically doubled down on Russiagate. Now, you can understand why Rachel Maddow would do that. She spent the last 4 years burning through her reputation, basically on Conspiracy Hour with Rachel Maddow. She's supposed to be the brain trust of the party. She's the one that all of these Democrats would sit down and organize themselves and stare at, waiting for their new propaganda and their new conspiracy theory for which to go out and fortify themselves during the Trump administration. And so when you have basically Durham and his investigation locking up various Democrats that were lying to the FBI in order to get Donald Trump either undermine his campaign or, for that matter, put him in jail, well, she needs encouragement. She needs to go to the source, a disgraced FBI agent that was basically fired for malfeasance on his job, in order to give her some level of confidence that the last 4 years of her basically lying and putting out one conspiracy theory after the next wasn't necessarily in vain, despite the fact that it was absolutely and entirely in vain. I remember when the Mueller investigation came back basically saying, yeah, we don't have anything on Trump on this. She cried after seeing that. It was phenomenal TV at that point. And not to mention, you had many other Democrats that basically stopped watching the show for a few days, not able to deal with the fact that all of these lies for 3 years came to nothing. And now you have reports out where they're basically saying, yeah, these people were lying to the FBI in order to get Donald Trump either arrested or at the very least undermine their campaign, or at the very least to get Hillary Clinton in office. And they were so confident that Hillary Clinton was going to win, they didn't even care that the stuff they were putting out was lunacy or nonsense, or that they were lying to the FBI. If Hillary Clinton wins, nobody's going to do an investigation into it, right? Well, unfortunately for them, Hillary Clinton lost. I strongly suspect that aspects of Rachel Maddow, the reports that she's not happy with the show, has everything to do with her burning her reputation for team allegiance for the last 3 years. I'll give you a perfect example. Keith Olbermann. I used to watch Keith Olbermann. I used to love his show during the Bush administration. At this point, again, another person disgraced working at MSNBC. But if you remember when Donna Brazile was in the situation where she basically came out trying to hawk her book saying, we cheated Sanders. We cheated the guy. The cancer in the party, or whatever she wants to say for that. But basically, we cheated Bernie. Here's the evidence of the fact that we cheated Bernie. Donna Brazile at the time was head of the Democratic Party. Keith Olbermann comes out. He's not shocked that they cheated Sanders. He's not perturbed by the fact that the electoral edifice to which we use and accrue around in order to determine who has legitimacy in office, that was basically corrupted like nobody's business in order to shaft one of the political candidates. No. He said, you've just lost your career, talking to Donna Brazile. Think about that for the moment. Keith Olbermann knows the truth. He knows that they were cheating Sanders. He knows that they were trying to ding and gut his campaign. His issue wasn't that they were cheating Sanders. His issue was being a team player. You've just destroyed your political career. Truth doesn't matter. Team matters. Hence, Rachel Maddow, same difference. Team matters. The Rhodes Scholar didn't necessarily mind destroying her reputation, looking insane for multiple years with her conspiracy hour on any and everything associated with Donald Trump. I remember one time she had a show saying Donald Trump was working with the Iranians for what? And it would just be night after night after night after night. It didn't necessarily matter how ridiculous it was. Even when she had Richard Engel on, one of the journalists, and he started the administration, said, look, they keep pushing the stuff out there to us, but we haven't been able to find any evidence on it. So I finally told them, give us the evidence or basically leave us to our own devices. Now, that didn't stop Rachel Maddow from basically burying that and going for the next several years, doing the exact opposite of what Engel told her was true. I strongly, Sussman, you have two people who basically got arrested. Sussman knew he was lying to the FBI when he hid the fact that he was working for Hillary Clinton. And the same thing is true for Danchenko. Both of them knew they were lying to the FBI. If it was perfectly innocent, why lie to the FBI, right? Lying in this case is intrinsically linked to their motives and their objectives, the things that they wanted to accomplish. They knew that divulging their political intentions and the bogusness of the fake news that they were pushing would undermine their objective. They fully understood it. The objective being a mass psyop using the FBI to give credence to conspiracy theories to damage Trump, or at their highest aspiration, get Trump prosecuted with basically trumped up charges. This resulted, of course, in Crossfire Hurricane, which was basically the interrogation of the Trump campaign on whether or not it was connected and working with the Russians. So she pulls Strzok from basically obscurity after being fired for inappropriateness dealing with the FBI. In one case, having an affair with one of the other people on the team. And in another case, basically, as he's investigating Trump, basically attacking and berating Trump, and as he was investigating Hillary Clinton, giving her a pass, even going so far as to changing the wording on some of the drafting, or for that matter, giving immunity to some of the top people that were associated with Clinton. Stuff that was weird and bizarre if you were actually trying to build a case on somebody. But in this case, seemingly to protect Hillary Clinton, then immediately moved over to Donald Trump after he was successful at protecting Hillary Clinton. This is the person that Rachel Maddow brings on the show. Let's play the first clip. I'm not going to go through both of these because I don't want these to go too long. But this is Strzok on Maddow. Let's play the clip.
And so let me be clear. Lying to the FBI is a significant crime. It's a crime if the National Security Advisor does it. It's a crime if, as alleged, Mr. Danchenko did that during his interviews with FBI agents. As you mentioned earlier, I have some concerns with the indictment of Michael Sussman. I'm concerned about whether or not that's a good use of government resources to charge him. But at the end of the day, it is a crime to lie to the FBI. But what isn't true is the backdrop to all this. You know, in next Saturday, John Durham will have been going on for 2.5 years. Now, compare that to Robert Mueller, who lasted less than 2 years, and in that time, charged and convicted people like Trump's national security advisor,
his
campaign manager, his deputy campaign manager, his personal attorney, his, personal Roger Stone, personal fixer, and a large number of very significant people that were key and critical to the Trump campaign and later to the administration. When I look at these two players, I see folks that were not involved in any of them.
Yeah, so if you notice, they're just lying to the FBI. And the person that they were lying to the FBI, he brings up Roger Stone, who they basically raided his house for supposedly lying to the FBI. And more to the point, none of these people were directly linked to what they were alleging that Donald Trump was working with the Russians. So he brings up this case of Mueller did all of this work. For one, Durham is basically working by himself with a small team. Mueller had basically all of the lawyers and all of the money in the world to find any and everything associated with Donald Trump. Let's play the next clip real quick.
And do you feel like that overall allegation is fair from Mr. Durham?
I agree with you. I think I'm certainly concerned when I read these indictments, both Mr. Sussman's and Mr. Danchenko's. I mean, look, Mr. Danchenko's indictment is 39 pages long. If you go through those 39 pages and pull out those facts that are actually relevant to the false statements that he's alleged to have made to the FBI, that's a smaller subset, much smaller subset of those 39 pages. And whether intentionally or not, when you look at the balance of those pages, they have subtle dog whistles to these kind of pro-Trump conspiracy theorists. Statements like, the FBI's investigation of the Trump campaign relied on certain things. Well, there was never an FBI investigation of the Trump campaign.
Stop right there.
Unless you listen to...
There was never an FBI investigation of the Trump campaign? What was Crossfire Hurricane? What was the Mueller probe or the Mueller investigation? Strzok is basically talking out of two sides of his mouth. It is nonsense.
Complete lie.
Yeah, just lying.
Complete
outright.
lie.
And of
Complete
course,
lie.
Rhodes Scholar Rachel Maddow is there lapping it all up for her Democratic people to be like, hey, it's okay. I know you're seeing the stuff in the paper that we were basically lying for all of these years and that this was basically a conspiracy theory that these guys were using in order to go after Donald Trump and undermine Trump. But it's okay. We have disgraced Agent Strzok here to give you the truth of it all. Utter nonsense. Shame.
Do you have the clip at the end, by any chance, when Rachel Maddow says goodbye, that kind of thing? Thanks him for coming on. We talked about this on the back end, and no big deal. Basically, she thanks him for coming on, and the way that she thanks him, my interpretation of it was she's thanking him for coming on because he's potentially under legal threat here because there's an ongoing investigation. He's one of the people at the top of a certain stack, and he's a head that a lot of people want to see on a spike. Figuratively, again, of course, legally, I'm talking, not literally. People want him in prison. People want him facing charges, that kind of thing.
That's right.
So,
especially if it has something to do with it.
That's why she thanks him. And when he says that this wasn't an investigation to the Trump campaign, that's not just a lie. Isn't that also a political defense? Isn't that him getting out and saying, no, we weren't investigating the Trump campaign, so that in court he can be like, well, I said we weren't doing it. That I don't know if it's going to work. I don't think it would by any means, but I can see him doing that, trying to set the record both for the courts and for the American public. Granted, I don't think it's going to work.
I mean, let's be clear for the moment. What they were giving, or the information that they were giving, was able to get an investigation into Carter Page, which was basically part of the Trump administration. On top of getting the thing for Carter Page, they lied continuously in order to keep the FISA warrant on Page, even when they found out he was like a CIA informant or something to that effect. Basically changing records in some of these cases in order to keep that investigation going. Strzok is lying through his teeth here. And they know exactly what's taking place. I mean, when Rachel Maddow made the statement of, she basically explained it. She was like, well, this looks as if people were spying or lying to the FBI in order to get them to go after Trump, and et cetera. Is that fair of John Durham? In which case he's like, no, that's not fair of John Durham at all. That is exactly what they were doing.
Yeah.
That is exactly what they were doing. So, yeah, they are doubling down on nonsense. He even goes so far as to say, well, the FBI wasn't able to verify or not verify, meaning basically that the FBI wasn't able to clear Trump on this, even though they couldn't necessarily find anything incriminating. Even that's a lie.
But you can't prove a negative, bro. You can't prove a negative.
That's basically what he's trying to say. But the thing is, you can say, is the statement true or false?
Yes.
You can do that. And the FBI clearly didn't believe that there was any validity to that.
But even then, it's like, or is the statement because it's supported or unsupported, you know?
Yeah.
Does it refer to an event that took place, or did somebody just pull it out of their butt? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the quote here is, quote, the indictment makes a point to note that the FBI was unable to corroborate Steele's reporting, but at the same time, it neglects to mention that we weren't able to disprove it either.
Yeah.
End quote. Again, basic sort of logic, rhetoric stuff here. Proving a negative is either impossible or very difficult, depending on the specific that we're talking about, or just difficult. You know what I mean? You can prove a positive, but disproving, saying to an absolute certainty what you've said is not true, usually quite a bit harder. My point is that's not the standard that the FBI uses or should use for giving any given report veracity. It's whether you can prove it, not whether you can disprove it. It's a little bit maybe obscure for some people.
No, I don't think that's obscure at all. I mean, what other standard are they going to use to go by? If you're doing a criminal investigation, you're trying to determine whether or not this person is more likely or not likely to be guilty. And at the point where you can't corroborate what they're telling you, I mean, typically you look at that and say, okay, we can't corroborate it. We don't necessarily have to think to charge the person. The person is innocent until proven guilty. Almost by definition in our legal system, you're innocent until proven otherwise.
Yes,
and if you can't necessarily prove it otherwise, then by logic or so much, you're innocent. At the very least, from a legal standpoint.
Otherwise,
he's sitting here acting as if, well, we couldn't prove it, but we couldn't disprove it.
Otherwise, you just wage cases for years and years and years. Well, it hasn't been disproven.
Yeah.
We have no evidence to support it, but it hasn't been disproven. So there's still a possibility, and we're going to still waste all our time and attention and years, hundreds of people, large amounts of manpower. Again, I'm referring to Trump specifically here. I've extended it out slightly. Let's go into a break.
Yeah.
We'll be coming back, speaking with Peter Oliver on the other side. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Let's go into Europe. Let's hop across the pond and have a conversation about things that are taking place in Europe. So yesterday, the Biden administration basically opened up the borders, allowing people to come in, providing they had either COVID tests or vaccinations or something to that effect. But they're going to be allowed to basically come into the States now. Well, for the longest time, for several months, Europeans weren't, despite the fact that Americans could go to Europe. I know that because I went to Europe during that time frame, and even for the Biden-Putin summit, that was something that we were basically allowed into the country for. Now, at the exact same time, you have a spike in COVID in Europe, which means that at the time where they basically have unraveled this notion of preventing people from coming into the United States, you basically have a COVID spike in the country that they're now allowing to come into the United States. Talk about bad timing. To have a conversation about this and another issue with migrants in Belarus, we're joined with the one and only Peter Oliver. Peter Oliver is an EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, what's going on, my man?
Hello. Hi. How's it going? I'm very well. Thank you very much, lads. How are yourselves?
So far, so good. Rough morning, but I think we're making it.
I'm fantastic. Jamarl had another rough morning. Thank you for joining us, Peter.
That's what I like to hear, Shane. Thank you. I was regretting asking for a second then.
No. Don't regret asking. Things are fine. We've leveled it out. So what is going on with this? I thought it was very weird that there was no reciprocity in regards to, okay, Americans can go into Europe, but not vice versa. And that's during the time where America was basically the epicenter of the pandemic. I mean, we have like 750,000 people that have died over this. And yet, Europe was the one that we were basically keeping out of the country. Why did Europe basically allow that? I mean, was this just one of those things where Europe wanted the travel dollars? What was the reasoning where they didn't necessarily lean on the reciprocity between these two things?
You got it the first time, Jamal. You fell a little bit the second time. I'm not going to venture trying to say that word. But I don't have a definitive answer on that. But what I do have is a lot of anecdotal evidence, a lot of anecdotal gatherings of information based on my own travellings around Europe this summer for work and for pleasure as well. And a lot of American tourists, in fact, far more American tourists in places like Rome, where I've been, in Vienna, also in Greece as well, than I think I've seen in a long time. And I know from talking to people like my camera operator, he was in Croatia earlier this year, and he said he hadn't seen as many people from the United States since when he used to work in New York. So it does seem like the European travel sector has benefited massively from the ability for US tourists to come to Europe, and US tourists have taken them up on that throughout the summer. Today, though, it's about going the other way, and or at least in the last 24 hours, about going the other way. And I know there've been some lovely heart-rending stories about families and relationships and children reunited after what is a really long time when you look at it. Some people have been 2 years for some people that they've not been able to be reunited with family. So what this does is it sorts out that as well. What it also does is it means that you're going to see a lot of European tourists heading to the United States. I think for the city of New York, they take around 1 million British tourists every single year. That's going to be a huge boost to the city of New York. However, one thing that we are being warned about in Europe is that if you are jumping to book trips to the United States, that we should beware that in cities like New York, there are still hangovers from the COVID pandemic, and the idea that there is, I mean, it's maybe complete rubbish. If anybody is listening from New York, please just get in touch with me on Twitter and let me know I'm talking absolute nonsense.
No,
this is just what I'm hearing.
I've heard,
but saying that there's problems in the supply chain when it comes to employment, that you may be able to get the exact wording I heard was you might be able to get your flight to New York, but you may well stand in a long line for a coffee and a bagel because of the people haven't come back into the cities post-COVID. I don't think we can really say we're post-COVID because, you know, we are in the grips of that virus still, but people haven't gone back to jobs that previously they'd been in yet.
100%. That's a factor. I went up to NYC this weekend with my brother, actually. Had a good time. And I'd heard from Ted Rall, Michael Goodwin, guests on this show, that it still has problems, and it makes sense. I personally didn't see that, but granted, my frame of reference is also like quite a while back, and like 1970s New York that I've seen in movies. I've been there a couple times. My point is, they might have more crime than they did a year or two ago, and I think the same would hold true about the economic slump. I'm curious, coming back to Europe. Europe, like you mentioned, has had its borders open to U.S. travelers, some of them, vaccinated ones particularly, I believe, for a while now. It's only now that we're seeing the reciprocation. Has this aroused any sort of, I don't know, resentment among the Europeans? Why aren't they letting their tourists in? Why aren't we letting your tourists in, basically? Or is that just in my imagination? Peter?
If you've spent 2 years, I think it all depends on your situation. If you've spent 2 years separated from loved ones and you're seeing people coming for 2 weeks of a good time in Paris and Berlin and Vienna and Rome, you're going to be upset about that, aren't you? Because, you know, you would think that you had the better reason to be going over to the United States. I think ultimately, though, there's not been that much of resentment towards the situation. I think there's a lot of relief, particularly if you are involved in that tourism sector, if you're involved in any way in getting Europeans over to the United States to spend money. Well, you'll be very happy today. And I've noticed you've seen like CEOs of Virgin Atlantic, also Delta, who've been on just about every TV show this morning, saying how happy they are that this has happened. Of course they're happy, because that's their bread and butter, and they've only been able to send one set of tourists one way for such a long time. So that's all changed now.
I'm curious, do they know what caused this kind of reinvigoration of COVID in Europe?
Well, this is what you're right to say, that this has come, of course, at the same time as particularly in Germany, where I'm speaking to you from. We have the highest numbers of COVID infections that we've actually had for the whole of the pandemic. In the last 7 days, I think it was just over 200 people per 100,000 of the population in Germany has become infected with COVID. That's higher than the previous highest, which was just before Christmas of 2020. Depends on who you listen to. If the suggestion is that there is a little bit of fatigue with the restrictions, that people haven't been taking some things as seriously as they should have been. Also, just to put to anecdotal evidence, now we're supposed to have a COVID pass here that we have to show in certain locations. I have been for work in Rome quite recently, in Paris as well, and you have to show that pass everywhere. Everywhere you go, where's your pass? There you go, scan it. Now you can come in. I don't think I've been asked for it once in Berlin. Wow. So it isn't a legal prerequisite here in Germany as it is in some other places. That may be about to change, which we'll come to in just a little minute. If you listen to the politicians, then what this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. That's according to Jens Spahn, who's the acting health minister in Germany at the moment. I say acting health minister because we still haven't formed a government following the election back in September yet. Basically what happened is Germany was slow to get the vaccinations going. Once they got the vaccinations going, they did it really well. The vaccination rate is around 70% at the moment nationally, and it's been there or thereabouts for about 2 months now. And what they're finally realizing is that those people that haven't come forward to get a vaccine aren't likely to come forward and get a vaccine voluntarily. So what you're seeing now is it was called the 3G approach here in Germany. That's geimpft, genesen, and getested. Basically, if you're vaccinated, you've recovered, or you've been tested. Now they're wanting to bring that down to a 2G, which is basically only the vaccinated and those that can prove that they've recovered from COVID-19 within the last 6 months, that they're going to have more access. And this is all being put forward by the government in waiting, essentially. The three parties that are in coalition talks at the moment that will most likely see Olaf Scholz of the Social Democrats take over from Angela Merkel as German Chancellor. His people and the people from the other two parties that he's negotiating with have put out a lot of information today that would see Germany really come into line a little bit more with Italy, who have incredibly strict rules on this, particularly when it comes to the workplace, and they have lower figures as well. Also, Austria, which has put in place quite strict rules. Now, it is worth noting that Germany, in some way similar to the United States, is a federal system that the individual states that make up the Federal Republic of Germany, they do have a little bit of free rein to make their own rules on certain things. They have quite a lot of free rein, actually, to make their own rules on certain things. And you're looking at states like Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, off the top of my head, what is the other one I'm thinking of? But okay, Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria at least, and some others, I think the state of Saxony and the state of Thuringia as well, have been looking to put in place stricter rules that you can only enter certain places if you can prove that you've been vaccinated. Basically, that vaccine passport is going to be essential, it would seem, to get into certain areas, just as it is in other European countries. I mentioned just off my own experience, you walk into anywhere in Paris, they're going to insist on you showing it. You walk into anywhere in Rome, they're going to insist on you showing it. So I would imagine the same thing is coming here to Berlin and to the rest of Germany pretty soon.
That makes perfect sense. Well, and also Italy having that first, I'm only speculating here, and hopefully you can fill in the facts. It seems like they had the big rash of infections early on when COVID first came to the continent, basically. They were the ones to first deal with it. And so having had that trauma, sort of they, reacted to it, they responded. And it makes sense to me that they would be one of the first countries to implement that strongly. We also wanted to talk with you about the migrant crisis at the border between Belarus and Poland. Also, Lithuania is coming in. These are migrants. Can you just please explain who are these migrants? Where are they coming from? And can you set this up for us? What's actually happening here? This is a sort of diplomatic dispute between Belarus and Poland, but also, there are humanitarian groups in Poland criticizing the Polish prime minister for not taking them in. So there's another side of this too. Peter, what's going on here?
On many different levels. On the macro level, on the border, this is the Polish border with Belarus, but widening out, this is Europe's border. This is the EU border, the European Union border with Belarus, a non-EU state. It is ugly at the moment, and it shows no sign of improving anytime soon. Basically, what you have is you've got thousands of migrants from the Middle East, mostly from, according to my colleague who's on the ground there, most of the people who he's met are either from Afghanistan or from Iraq, who got on flights mostly from Iraq and headed to Minsk, with the idea being if they got from Belarus into Poland, then they can get to Germany, which is the destination of choice. Germany.
Peter, I want to cut in for just a second, just a point of clarification.
Yeah.
Timing in terms of Afghanistan and the fall of Afghanistan, the Taliban rising to power, is this wave partly driven or largely driven by the events of mid-August? It's a little bit later, but just trying to connect it, Peter.
I can't say one way or the other whether those events would have led to this, but these would be people that had left Afghanistan and arrived either in Iraq or in some cases in Lebanon. So you've got to factor in how long it takes to essentially walk to Iraq. I think that's it. It would be. I mean, look, I'm not going to put a time frame on how long that takes to happen, but in many cases, these were people that were already in migrant camps in Lebanon or were in areas in Iraq who were looking to get out. What the European Union did a little while ago is they put a block on, and it came to an agreement with Iraq to stop flights taking people to Minsk. from which then they can try and cross over there. Now, what we've seen on Monday, this has been going on for a couple of months now, but what we saw on Monday was a massive escalation. In fact, you saw a huge group of people arriving at the border with Poland. They were trying to beat down that border fence. They were sent back by Polish troops who were on the border there. Poland sent 12,000 extra troops to the border. They were equipped with pepper sprays, and there was some on video that was issued by the Polish Ministry of Defense. You could hear gunshots being fired. We're pretty sure that we know that they were as warning shots being fired into the air. And it just one localized incident that took place, but it's been a lot of really quite tense standoffs where you've seen people equipped with wire cutters, spades, even just trying to beat down barbed wire, being pepper sprayed at point blank in their face by border guards on the other side. And it's really reminiscent of what we saw in 2015 and the migrant influx into Europe in 2015. Different in many ways, different in some ways, because this is a land crossing into Europe as opposed to the sea crossings that were people trying to cross from Turkey across the Aegean Sea towards the Greek islands and the Greek mainland, and then making a land journey, ideally coming to Germany, many of them trying to come to Germany. In fact, some of the groups that we've seen in Belarus have been chanting Germany, Germany all the way along. I was on RT just before I came to talk to you guys, and my colleague who's there had a report in which he was speaking to people who were on that Belarusian side of the border, and every one of them said that they wanted to either come to Germany or to France, and that was their aim. But in order to do that, they have to get into Poland first and cross Poland. What we're seeing from the European side is they are blaming Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, firmly for what's gone on here. We've heard from the German Foreign Ministry yesterday. We got comment from them in which they told us that they have evidence that the presidential office in Belarus is behind organizing people to come to Belarus from on these flights from places like Iraq, with the intention of sending people towards Europe. We heard from NATO yesterday, who referred to what is going on as hybrid tactics from the Belarusian side. Now, as far as Alexander Lukashenko is concerned, the Belarusian president has said he has absolutely nothing to do with what he's been accused of. What he has said, though, is that his country cannot look after these people because they don't have the funds to be able to do it, because they're currently being sanctioned by the European Union. Now, what may well happen, and certainly the fact if you've got 12,000 Polish troops on the border, and you've also got Lithuania saying as well that they're going to send their troops to that Polish border in order to shore up that frontier. We've heard from Germany in the last few weeks saying that they're going to do the same thing. That border is going to become uncrossable. If that border does become uncrossable, you've then got a situation that could turn into a very, very dire humanitarian crisis, where you have had potentially, we don't know how many, potentially thousands of people in Belarus looking to try and seek asylum in the European Union, but they're stuck in Belarus, a country that doesn't have the ability to feed and look after them in any way. So this has the potential to get a lot worse before it gets any better. From the EU side, in terms of what they're going to do, we heard from Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, on Monday evening. They're talking about sanctions again. Now, again, yesterday, heard from the German Interior Ministry. They're saying they want sanctions against Belarus. Now, in terms of what there's left to sanction in Belarus, there's not a lot. What the sanctions may well take the form of is any airlines that are flying people from, say, Baghdad to Minsk. Those airlines could be under sanction as well, no matter what country they come from, because in some ways what Alexander Lukashenko is saying is true, is that his country is financially severely damaged by sanctions put in place on it by the European Union. There's not a lot left to sanction that doesn't in turn harm the EU. In fact, the only thing that makes money for Belarus at the moment, really, and this is a big generalization, but it is their main cash crop, is potash, which is used for fertilizer in the European Union. That's pretty much one of the only things that isn't sanctioned, because if that was to be sanctioned, well, then there would be problems with next year's crops for the European Union and for farmers in the EU. It is a huge, colossal mess, and it's worthwhile pointing out that while we're talking about this in terms of politics and diplomacy and geopolitical chess, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people currently in a forest on the border between Poland and Belarus in what are absolutely freezing conditions. Many of whom are telling my colleagues that they don't have water, they don't have food, they've got children with them. And this has the potential to be a huge catastrophe.
How's Europe going to handle this? I mean, because if they're basically increasing sanctions on Belarus, which is basically going to undermine any incentive that Belarus has to do anything about it, and if the migrants get through, I mean, I guess I'm thinking, what is Europe's policy going to be? Because, you know, this happened once before during the Syrian war. You had all of these people that basically flooded into Europe, which basically destabilized the politics of Europe. And you had many of these right-wing groups that were able to gain hay off of the fact that you had many of the migrants that were coming into the country. So I would imagine this is not necessarily something Europe wants to go through again. So how are they going to deal with this?
Right. An expansive question. We've got about 5 minutes left. I'm going to have to be quick here. What you have is, well, look, you've got Poland today warning of a possible armed escalation on the border. If shots are fired and somebody is killed, this takes on a whole new level of a whole new level of horrible with what is going on. In terms of how it's being viewed in relation to the 2015, 2016 migrant crisis we saw then, what you have is, I mean, that led to essentially the rise of the respectable face of the far right in Germany, a country which hadn't had a far right party since, well, 1945. You have already seen, because you've got to remember, what I'm saying is that these people who are trying to get into Poland, they're not trying to stay in Poland. They want to come to Germany, they want to come to France. Two countries that have taken in many, many, many people and have, in particular in Germany's case, they've gotten good at getting people asylum, getting them looked after and getting them integrated. And they got good because they had to get good at it because so many people arrived at once. However, that doesn't mean that Germany is an overwhelmingly welcoming country to people who are coming into it this way. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we had an incident on the Polish border in which police arrested, I think it was around 40 people who were described as being part of a far-right militia who were patrolling the border looking for migrants. They were armed with machetes and bats and other weapons. And so they were arrested and disarmed. They were later found to have connections to far-right and neo-Nazi groups. So what this does is it feeds into those type of agendas. It groups that would have died out a long time ago, it gives them a little bit more of a shot in the arm. And unfortunately, every time there is some kind of incident or escalation, the whole roundabout starts again, the merry-go-round starts again. And as I said, you've got the Polish guards at the moment, the Polish border guards warning of a possible armed escalation. I think if that happens, then I don't know, because what you can't have, and what seems to be the 100% the attitude from the European side, is that they will not deal with Lukashenko directly. After the election earlier this year, they saw him as last year they saw him as done and gone. They don't recognize him. So they're not going to do a deal with Lukashenko like they did a deal with Erdogan in Turkey in order to get him to give money to Belarus to look after migrants in Belarus.
Here's
like
where
money was given to
Peter,
Turkey in order to look after migrants in Turkey. Yeah.
No, thank you. And sorry for cutting in. We're pretty much out of time. But this is what rankles me about this is, okay, Iraq, Afghanistan, the countries of origin, the instability. What caused that instability? It was America, yes, but also NATO, including a bunch of European member countries invading, getting involved.
Poland as well. There was 2,000 Polish troops took part in the invasion of Iraq.
Thank you for filling that in. You see where I'm going there. There's a moral responsibility that seems even stronger than the one that applied, Syrian civil war with migrants coming through Turkey. Less of Europe took part. With Iraq and Afghanistan, even with that one, I'd say there was a responsibility, but Iraq and Afghanistan all the more so. And it seems like they're using Lukashenko as a reason to not have to deal with it. Okay, we don't like him, so we're not going to deal with it. Peter Oliver, great conversation. Thank you for joining us. Peter Oliver is the EU correspondent for RT, Russia Today. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of this morning show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Right on. Good conversation with Peter Oliver. Let's go into the headlines. In the news, yesterday in the United States, there were 126,461 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,222 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 73,875 cases per day, an increase of 5% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 58% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 67% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 46,575,792 Americans, or people across the United States, and has killed an unfortunate 755,273 men, women, and children in America. It looks like that number is going to hit 800,000 before Christmas. That's unfortunate. In Russia, deaths from the novel coronavirus have reached a daily record of 1,211. Wow, the country's highest death toll yet in the pandemic. 1,211, that is a major number. That is huge in comparison to the United States. The United States is, 320 million people?
Russia's 144.1 million, so a little bit less than half.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
That's
on a per capita
huge.
basis. Their cases are, I think, a little bit lower than ours, but on a per death, or, on a death basis, they're seeing more yesterday.
That's extreme.
Yeah.
In national news, the Justice Department yesterday argued that the federal government had the authority to mandate employees or employers require the employees to be vaccinated. This came in the form of a 28-page filing before the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which blocked the vaccine mandate last week. Organizers for the Day In Music Festival announced late Monday, rapper Travis Scott will no longer perform at this weekend's event in Las Vegas following the deadly crowd surge at Houston's Astroworld Festival. Investigators are working to determine all possible causes of death and injuries to scores of concert goers, including whether a batch of counterfeit pills, possibly laced with fentanyl, played a role, according to the Wall Street Journal. Wow, that is big. I thought fentanyl made you sleepy, though, or kind of disengaged.
It's like a more potent, shorter lasting version of heroin that's extremely dangerous because it is more potent, shorter lasting, and so people will overdose on it.
Yeah.
And they do it more constantly.
They can basically forget to breathe.
Yeah, and
that type of
can I
stuff.
pause on this for just a second?
Mm-hmm.
Just a second. We were talking Afghanistan about the end of opium production and how they're pivoting away from that. I saw a Vice News article, I think, on Friday over the weekend. And I'm just depressed with some of America's culture and stuff. The Vice News article talking about basically and I get why they're doing it, sympathetically, with the drop in heroin imports, heroin users are facing real problems. And I get where they're going, but it's like, are you really going to cry about how we have less heroin in the States? Is that where your mind's at? I get where they're coming from, but still, that's not a good place to be, ultimately.
Where's their mind at on that? That just seems weird all the way around.
Their mind is, you got a bunch of addicts, and those addicts, due to the lack of heroin, are turning to more dangerous alternatives. And therefore, some of those people are going to die. But still, are you really going to lament the lack of heroin? Is that, I can see both sides.
Are there really dangerous alternatives to heroin? I mean, it's kind of like you have this extremely dangerous drug, but this other drug that's
even worse.
Yeah, like 1 degree worse. Dude, I don't think the 1 degree worse matters in that case. Both of them are deadly. Yeah, heroin is a vicious drug. That's you shouldn't lament addicts not having access to heroin. That's just weird.
Yeah.
This is very, very weird. An armed paramedic who was shot by Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin, last year testified Monday that he pulled out his own firearm because he believed Rittenhouse was an active shooter. Gage Rosenkreuz, or I'm not sure how to pronounce this last one.
Rosenkreuz.
Said it one more time.
I need to look this one up myself.
Rosenkreuz? Okay. Gage Rosenkreuz testified that he unholstered his handgun on August 25th, 2020, as he and a crowd followed Rittenhouse, who had just fatally shot another man. Rittenhouse fell to the ground, fired twice at an unknown person, and fatally shot Anthony Huber.
Gage Grosskreutz. And have you seen the minute of testimony with Gage Grosskreutz? So the defense attorney takes him. We should come back to it.
Okay, we'll come back.
Yeah.
In international news, a new Chinese aircraft carrier with technology nearly equaling the capabilities of its U.S. counterpart could be launched as soon as February next year. The installation of major external and internal components, including power plants and aircraft launching systems, appear to either be finished or on the verge of completion. CSIS said only a few additional items, such as radar and weapon systems, remain to be installed before the vessel can slip into the Yangtze River. I keep saying, man, China is an economic and material powerhouse. They have 3 times our population. And from the standpoint of technology, they are clearly where we are, if not, in some respects, surpassing us. This notion that it is a cakewalk or that we're going to get into this military conflict with them is insanity. It's just insanity. I mean, even the hypersonic missiles or the cruise vehicle and everything else, the United States was shocked at that stuff. And no, that is not something we necessarily have in our inventory in regards to skill sets. This needs to be very careful. I mean, but just to be very clear, the reason that China is doing this is because of our bellicosity. It's not a thing in and of itself. I mean, all things being equal, I don't necessarily think China will want to be spending that much money on military. But in this very specific case, they have to protect themselves. They have to protect their investments. You have the U.S. basically saying that they're going to fight them over Taiwan. It's due diligence at this point. It's unfortunate. Tensions are escalating on the border between Poland and Belarus after Polish officials again accused their neighbor of helping move migrants towards the frontier and warned that thousands of additional military personnel have been mobilized to respond to the confrontations. In the latest in a weeks-long migration crisis at the border, the head of the Polish border guard said that groups of people were attempting to breach the border on Monday evening. Yeah, we just had this conversation with Peter Oliver, so definitely go back and check it if you want to hear more about it. In business news, U.S. industrial giant General Electric was split into 3 companies, followed years of seeing its stock underperform. The company announced on Tuesday the company will be divided into separate units focused on aviation, healthcare, and energy. In holiday news, it is Carl Sagan Day, Chaos Never Dies Day. I love that. Basically entropy. Go to an art museum day, and Microtia Awareness Day. Microtia? What is that?
Microtia. It's basically having small ears. It's like a genetic defect kind of thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very little ears.
They get their own day. Very cool. Very cool. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
It occurs when the ear or ears do not fully develop during the first trimester of pregnancy. This leaves the child with small, underdeveloped, or no ears at all.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's rough. So let's go back to the other one.
Gage Grosskreutz.
Yeah.
Who's the living dude the one guy standing who Kyle Rittenhouse shot, because Kyle Rittenhouse, remember, this is the then 17-year-old, now 18-year-old, who went to Kenosha, Wisconsin during the Black Lives Matter protests. He says to protect his city. A lot of other people say because
it wasn't even a city.
It wasn't even a city, though. You know, various reasons why, you know, he's getting prosecuted in this way. And there's a lot of public attention being paid to it. And like the Derek Chauvin trial, this is a sort of second legal referendum on BLM as a whole, I think. Or not BLM necessarily, but like all of last summer's events. What do you think about that, just briefly?
I think it's a referendum on this guy getting a gun, jumping across state lines, and basically killing somebody who wanted to play soldier. That's what I think it is.
I hear you. I don't want. There's something there, but I don't want to inflate it to be like, oh, this is. I said this is a referendum. That's a bit too far, but there's something there. This is important in the context of how we will remember BLM. I would say it's going to be a big event in that.
I don't see how it's related to BLM. This seems related to him. I mean, don't get me wrong. I know that in some places the protests and everything else, but keep in mind, BLM weren't the only one that were protesting. A lot of these people were multiracial,
it's
et cetera,
true,
et cetera.
But people come and to that point, through all three of the people he shot, none of them were black.
Yeah. Exactly.
None of them were black, literally. But as far as I can tell, they were all there under the Black Lives Matter banner. Whether they should
it's
be
just because all the protests were called Black Lives Matter. But I feel you.
Anyway, so so Gage Grosskreutz, Kyle Rittenhouse, when he went down to Kenosha, Wisconsin that day, shot 3 people. 2 of them he killed. One he didn't.
Mm-hmm.
The
one he didn't kill.
This is the one he didn't kill. This is his testimony. And there is about a 1 and 15-second period that I want to get as a clip to play. A little bit later in the show, we'll be coming back to this. Basically, Gage Grosskreutz, faced by the defense attorney, has to answer, okay, there's this picture, and you can see it in the video, and that's why I was a little bit hesitant about whether or not we should even play it, because it partly relies on video. Anyway, there's enough audio that we should definitely get into it. When he's tasked with answering these questions by the defense prosecutor, basically, he is, in this image, it's very clearly pointing a gun at Kyle Rittenhouse as his arm gets blown off by the rifle, like the AR-15 or whatever style rifle that Kyle Rittenhouse is pointing at him. And the prosecutor goes through a couple of rounds of asking him questions. First, he asks him, basically, did Kyle Rittenhouse shoot you? Something like this. Did Kyle Rittenhouse shoot you exactly when you aimed a gun at him? And he says yes. And he asks, did Kyle Rittenhouse shoot you because you aimed the gun at him? He says no. So he's basically saying, no, it's not because of that. It's because of something else. You know, but he just says no.
Because at this point, he had killed 2 people.
He had already killed 2 people.
Okay.
Then the defense prosecutor goes through a couple of rounds of questioning, basically showing, okay, when you were standing 5 feet away with your arms raised in the air, Kyle Rittenhouse did not shoot you. Correct? And this guy says, yes, correct. When you moved closer and you aimed your gun at his head, that's when he shot you. Correct? And the guy says, yes. Basically completely undoing what he'd said just a minute before. Yeah. So this is the sole living survivor.
Yeah.
Who's now, within the course of 40 seconds, walking back the main thing that he just said in his defense. You know, was this self-defense basically, or did he shoot me for no reason? That kind of thing. And then as this happens, defense sort of backs off because he got his victory, he got his bite in the neck, whatever. And you can see the prosecution, the attorney for the prosecution, sitting there at the table with his head in his hands.
Yeah, realizing how horrible.
God, this is so bad. Yeah. And the thing is, I don't know. In my personal opinion, Kyle Rittenhouse shouldn't have been there that night. He should probably get a couple of years in prison for being reckless. On the other hand, I don't want to put him away in life. I think a lot of people are using him as a referendum and see him as just like the exemplar of whatever white America and are trying to punish him for that. And I don't think that that's the good way to go about these things. That's kind of where I stand on this stuff. But having seen that footage, that's a huge, huge problem for the prosecution. It's a big thing for them.
Maybe. I mean, it sounds like a huge problem for that guy. I mean, but keep in mind, he had already killed 2 people. And so from the standpoint of somebody who's looking at this guy who's already murdered 2 people.
It's true.
Then, it gets a little dicey. It's like, it does undermine the case for him big time. I mean, if you're saying, well, he shot me for no reason. Well, it sounds like he did shoot you for a reason, but you pulled out the gun.
Yeah.
You may have been justified in pulling out the gun because you thought he had already killed 2 people, et cetera. But, that makes it far more murkier.
It doesn't change the entire case, though.
Yeah.
And what I do see is people on the right coming out and saying the case is over, basically. And the case is not over. This is a big dent in one side of the case, but it's not over. And so we'll see what happens with that. People on the right are probably going to think the case is over. Probably he's going to face some charges. We'll see what actually happens.
Yeah, I'm not sure why they think the case is over. Yeah. I mean, it may, because again, if you've already killed 2 people, is it insane for a person to try to hold you under arm with this notion of, okay, we need to stop this person. This guy has already killed 2 people. By the same token, does a person have a right to defend themselves even after they killed 2 people? So I don't know the legalities associated with that part. But we do know he crossed into a state. He had no business crossing into a state. He decides he wants to pick up a gun and be a soldier. And in doing so, gets, I guess, the pat on the back by the cops on some level, almost like deputizing him in this kind of weird way. And even when he walks back to the cop, holding a weapon, after 2 people got shot, the cop still was like, okay, get out of here. Which is, I mean, all that stuff was just very, very weird. No, I don't take this as a referendum on BLM. I take this as a referendum on somebody taking a gun and deciding that they're going to go out and basically be vigilante in the various things. I mean, a case can be made of saying he was out there because of everything that was taking place with the protests and the marching and the violence in some of the localities of a few percentage points of violence. That's a fair point.
A few percentage points of violence. Come on.
No, I said a few percentage points of violence, whatever the violence thing was, meaning every protest wasn't violent. And I think the overwhelming majority, I think it was like 90-something, weren't violent at all.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I mean, I could see that. But
I'm just saying, whatever the percentage points amount of violence that was there, he decided he wanted to go to have some kind of influence one way or the other.
Well, but here's where it gets a little bit to me. Maybe the vast majority of protests were peaceful, but you had some big protests in cities that were explicitly not peaceful for like days, weeks on end. So,
Portland, California.
Yes, my point is, Kenosha, Wisconsin probably was the site of one of those protests. So when he goes out there, I'm sure that it's not like there was nothing going on. I'm sure that there was a bunch of local stuff going on. In fact, you can see the footage with the, back when this actually happened last year. You can see the footage of all of it playing out. There was a bunch of stuff going on in the streets. That's why cops were, of course, out in large numbers.
And too bad he didn't live in Wisconsin.
Yeah,
there's that too.
Well, here's the thing. Maybe we should go into a break. It's just, what difference does that make? I want to come back to this later in the show.
To another state. I mean, it's one thing if you're saying, I'm defending my property, I'm defending my house, I'm defending my neighborhood. On something like that, I think people give a little bit more leeway to that. I mean,
but is that the only line here? Is that the only? If it was his state, would this be permissible?
No, God, no. But at the very least, I think it gives more credibility. Like if you were in Portland, Oregon. No, was it Portland? Yeah, if you were in Portland and you had the situation where they were basically setting up the Chaz, and it was this lawless zone where, people were able to, the cops weren't coming in and everything else. I think people will give more leeway for a person trying to defend themselves if they think the cops aren't doing anything. I'm freaked out. These guys have taken over this property. I have a right to defense and defense of self and defense of family like anybody else does, and the cops aren't there to do it. I think you get more credibility of doing that as opposed to saying, I'm going to leave into another state. I'm going to take a gun with me into this other state.
Well, but then here's the thing is, if you remember, Kenosha, Wisconsin was like the city for where he lived. He's not too far from the border. He's living in a sort of smaller, memory was a more rural community, basically. And then Kenosha is the big local city that he'd go to. So he might view it as his not hometown, but his backyard, that kind of thing, the city that he goes to. He might see it as his territory. My point is,
Illinois.
Yeah, but it's, not too far. That's my point, is that it's right across the border, maybe. Jurisdictionally, that's certainly going to apply. Morally, I'm not sure that it makes a difference, because his defenders will also paint him as the good guy who went out to protect the city. And I can see their argument, but I don't want to support it, because I don't want vigilante justice, because that completely derails our political system, and you can't just tolerate any given person going out with an AR-15 style rifle and shooting people they see as breaking the law.
Yeah, I don't know. I do think there's a difference morally in I'm defending myself versus I'm going to another state in order to kick up ruckus. I mean, it's like if he didn't go there, those people wouldn't have died, basically. At the very least, he wouldn't have been the one that killed him. So, but let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment. We're going to have a conversation talking about Build Back Better and whether or not the Congressional Progressive Caucus sold its supporters down the river, or whether this was good politics. Back in a moment.
Lines.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the D.C. area, you can always catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So the Congressional Progressive Caucus passes the Build Back Better. I'm sorry. They didn't pass the Build Back Better. They actually sidelined the Build Back Better, which was the reconciliation that was dropped from $3.5 trillion to $1.75 trillion and is basically sidelined while the Congressional Budget Office scores that particular bill. Moderates and right-wing Democrats say they would pass that bill and given assurances that they would pass that bill if it comes back to be budget neutral. Now, this seems to be somewhat of a fig leaf here, but which either way you look at it, Progressive Caucus passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, something they say they were not going to do unless both of the bills passed at the exact same time. However, after Virginia and after Democrats basically got shellacked in Virginia and for the most part barely got out of New Jersey alive, well, at that point, it gave them somewhat of a different focus on this notion that, okay, we have to get things done. We can't keep pushing up the Biden's presidential agenda. No, this had no effect on Manchin in regards to whether or not Manchin will hold up the president's agenda. However, lefties got squeamish and folded immediately. Let's have a conversation about this and whether or not this was the right thing to do. And even further, will this help Biden? And how would somebody even go about helping Biden in this situation, considering the latest polling? To have a conversation, we're joined with the one and only Ted Rall. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Jamal.
So let me ask you this. Do you think it was a mistake for them to pass Biden's Build Back Better? I mean, Jay Paul and the Congressional Progressive Caucus for the last 4 or 5 months, have basically said it's all or nothing. We're not passing yours unless you're going to pass ours. And once you pass ours, we'll walk with you in the sunlight through the daisies and the world will be great. Well, after Virginia and after New Jersey, that was over with. And these guys basically capitulated like a cheap suit and passed the bill without having their bill passed. They basically just got assurances that they'll pass it if it comes back budget neutral. Was this a mistake? I mean, do you believe the right-wing Democrats when they're saying this stuff, considering all of the kind of back and forth and the distrust that has been taking place over the last several months?
So 2 centrists got clocked in New Jersey and in Virginia. But somehow the lesson of that is that progressives should become more centrist. I'm going to quote one of the best rock and roll lines of all time. At their last concert at Winterland in San Francisco, the Sex Pistols played. And at the very end, Johnny Rotten just said, it was the last line he ever said as a member of the Sex Pistols, "Ever got the feeling you've been cheated?"
That's funny. Ever got the feeling you've been cheated? Well, it is weird, though, right? I mean, you've had the overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party, like 98%, basically saying, yes, we support Biden's agenda. Build Back Better. We support that infrastructure. We support all that. And based on 2, they're able to destroy that bill, meaning all of the fighting and back and forth, meaning if there was a perspective that was given to the public on Democrats' inability to get anything done, Democrats' inability to pass policy, et cetera, on some level, you can make a case that that was created in Congress, but I don't think you could put that at the doorstep of lefties, since lefties were willing to pass that bill almost immediately. I mean, it's a bit rich that they're turning around and pointing to the left on this. That's all.
Oh, well, they always point to the left, right? No matter what. If they win, if the centrists win, they say, well, this victory proves that we were right and that centrism it rocks. And if centrists lose, they say, well, it's the fault of progressives for not having voted for centrists. So no matter what, centrists always win. Heads they win, tails you lose. It's a ridiculous argument. And I think there's so much room for the 5 key Democrats who signed that letter to say that waiting for the CBO to come back and call this project budget neutral. Mm-hmm. It's hard to see how it's going to be enforceable. I mean, one of the big questions is, are they going to insist on budget neutrality overall for the 2 pieces of legislation in aggregate, or just for Build Back Better? Build Back Better is supposedly actually budget positive.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the infrastructure bill is about $250 billion in the hole, according to the CBO calculation that's already happened. So the question is Build Back Better going to be expected to cover that $250 or so billion as well? And that's not in the letter. And it's, you can just easily see how the 5 key centrists in the House could weasel out of this.
Well, there's also certain problems with the savings. I mean, part of the reason for the Medicare or the expansion of Medicare and everything else, where basically you could count that as savings. So you could say, okay, we can take this much out of it because we can save X amount on prescription drugs. We can save X amount in regards to health care of the various people. Medicare pays a little bit less than regular insurance. I mean, those were savings that they could basically stack up, not to mention the taxes, where they could say, okay, we're also bringing in tax revenue to cover it. Well, in the way that they've mangled this bill, it's unclear what's in it, meaning it's unclear on what changes they've had to make to this bill in order to get this bill over the finish line for some of the other Democrats. And so I guess my thing is, it's unclear whether or not they're going to pass this thing. Like, I guess my thought is this. Are they lying? Were they sold a bill of goods from the standpoint of Jay Paul and many of these other lefties? When AOC was asked about this, she basically said she didn't have any trust. She was like, at this point, they're basically trusting Biden to get his people online in order to pass it. I got to be honest, I don't quite know. It feels to me that they'll look for anything in order to shirk this bill. By the same token, they gave assurances to Biden and many of these other people that they were going to pass it. I'm not quite sure which one that's going to turn out to be. What are your thoughts?
Well, obviously, nobody knows what's really going to happen. But, if history serves as any kind of prediction of the future, any progressives who trust the centrists in the DNC or the Democratic Party are fools. And they do look like they've been rolled. If I could put money on it, I would definitely say they got rolled. This is not going to pass. If it passes, it's not going to pass big. And progressives come out of this looking really foolish because in the end, it boiled down to they held the line for 100 days. And then in the end, the president called them, talked to them for an hour, and he basically was like, please. And then they rolled. And, the president can't deliver this. And the president really can't deliver Manchin and Sinema in the Senate. Yeah. So I don't know what they were negotiating. I guess it was a Democratic thing where you negotiate against yourself effectively. They should have held the line. And I think this is a really big deal because after the perfidy of the way that Bernie was treated in 2016 and 2020, the way progressives were blamed for not voting for Hillary in 2016, and now this, I think the schism, the chasm that's opening up between the progressive and centrist parts of the Democratic Party is widening to the point where you really are looking at a possible split in the not too distant future.
Interesting.
Very interesting. Ted, another side of this. Build Back Better, simply, when are we going to see action on this? I know this is some prognostication on your part that I'm asking for, but when do you think we're actually going to see something?
Well, they're talking about doing it next week, right? That seems hard to imagine, but so much of this is happening behind closed doors that it's hard to say. I mean, basically, Biden has to put Biden's folks have to put all the pressure conceivable on the holdouts, and I just don't see it. I mean, I think this can's going to get kicked down the road a few more weeks, and I think they're going to run into the Christmas recess and think, oh God, we can't break without voting on something, and they'll end up passing sort of Build Back Better, times 0.35, not.
No, I knew what you mean. They were going to basically undermine it before they even pass it. I mean, and all of this stuff is taking place, like, it's going to be within a debt ceiling, and then there's like 2 or 3 other big things that are going to take place while this is happening. I think the thing is, though, there's a new poll that came out from USA Today, and it's, for people who thought, okay, Biden's polling couldn't get any worse. No, it can get worse, and it has gotten worse. Do you approve or disapprove of the job Biden has done as president? 37.8% say they approve. That's it, 37.8. 59% disapprove. What about Kamala Harris? Kamala Harris is 10 points less than that, where she's just at 27.8%, whereas disapprove, 51.2%. And then when you get further into it, it gets worse and worse. It says nearly half of those surveyed, 46% said Biden has done a worse job as president than they expected. Think about that. Nearly half of the people who they surveyed basically says, yeah, I think he did worse than what we expected him to do. Nearly 2/3 of Americans, 64%, say they don't want Biden to run for a second term in 2024. That includes 28% of Democrats. That's astonishing. And then it says right here, opposition to Trump running for a second term in 2024 was at 58%, meaning you have more people that don't want Biden to run for a second term than you did Trump after his first term. Here's another one. Americans overwhelmingly support the infrastructure bill Biden is about to sign, but they're split on the other one, on the reconciliation bill. So that creates this other kind of problem that if the right-wing Democrats know that, then it gives them a bit of cover to basically put a knife in that plan when they know that it's like half and half in regards to the people who basically support it versus the people that don't support it. This doesn't look good for Biden. And last that, before we go to this one, it says they were talking about the midterms, and they basically made this point that the last time around, right here, 2/3 of Americans said the country is on the wrong track, 66%. 1 in 5 says it's heading in the right direction. And they basically made this point about the midterms, saying that the parties, either with Bill Clinton or, for that matter, with Trump, they got killed in the midterms when it came around to the level of polling that Biden is at right now. Is there any way for him to get this back on task? Or is this basically, call it a day, the impression of the Biden administration by the American public is basically set in stone at this point?
I don't see how he pulls this out. I don't see what cards he has up his sleeve. I mean, the thing that's so remarkable about this is these terrible poll numbers. You're talking about an administration that hasn't really done anything typically catastrophic. There hasn't been a corruption scandal. They haven't started any stupid new wars that ended up losing. They haven't suffered a terrorist attack that seemed to be their fault.
And by the way, the media hasn't been hostile either.
Better. Pardon?
Well, and the media hasn't been hostile. I mean, Donald Trump went into basically a hostile media from day one, all the way through his administration. Biden didn't have to deal with a fraction of the hostility that Trump had to deal with.
That's very true. And that's, of course, even doubly true for Kamala Harris, who's basically been, absent or, we just haven't seen her. She's been invisible. And so that's the thing that's so interesting to me. It's like, the stock market's roaring along. By typical metrics, Americans should be pretty happy. The one thing that I would look at as an asterisk is the fact that the unemployment benefits have run out and the fact that we have this wacky job market where, there's tons of open jobs, but apparently you have to have 40 years experience in a PhD to fill them and be under 30 years of age. But otherwise, there's no, this administration hasn't really messed up in the way that would normally earn you a 30% approval rating. So what are we going to do, right? I mean, this is the Build Back Better is the last gasp of major policy that they can point to. And it's going to take a long time before, even if they passed it right now as is, for those billions of dollars to trickle down into the economy and to end up, making new subways and new charging stations and all that. It's going to be after the midterms. It might be after the next general election. And if I were in the White House, if I were a policy internal pollster, I would just be smacking myself in the head, wondering what to do, because I don't see how you get out of it.
Ted, another side of this I want to turn to, you're talking about the low approval rating. You said he hasn't done anything. I think that's the point in some sense. I'm paraphrasing you slightly. Trump did stuff. People got pissed at him over it. Biden hasn't. That proves all the more true for Kamala. And again, like you're saying, I don't know what they can actually do with it, especially as going to the midterms. It seems like they're going to lose whatever grasp on power they would have had that would have let them get some things done. So it's kind of moot. Another side of this that I wanted to turn to briefly, and I'm curious, it's moving slightly away from Biden's politics, specifically more just looking at the economic situation. We talked to you last week about New York City. You said it has still not fully recovered. Sad to hear that. Inflation, just briefly. People turning and pivoting on inflation. This is part of the sort of larger rollout of not only the original stimulus check earlier this year, of all of Trump's stimulus checks and bills last year, but arguably infrastructure package in preparation for Build Back Better. This sort of referendum on the extent of these bills, large part of that for a lot of people has to do with, okay, is this going to lead to inflation? And on that conversation, I saw a turn over the weekend where it went from inflation isn't happening to inflation probably isn't happening, but if it is, it's going to be mild, to inflation is happening and it's good. We're literally, MSNBC news article I saw yesterday, inflation is good and here's why. And it was parody. It's not the only one. A couple others came up simultaneously. So that's the pivot that's happening. And I don't think that a lot of Americans looking at that pivot happening are going to think anything other than this is insanity and they're trying to lie to us on behalf of the administration, which makes us, wants to make us okay with this or whatever. I think you see where I'm going. Maybe not. Ted, what's your take on this? Just, looking at Biden's presidency, looking at the economic situation on that measure, on inflation, which is probably going to be a problem in a way that we're not used to it being a problem. How do you think that's going to roll out in 2022, 2023, 2024?
Although reality, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that I'm part of the inflation is actually kind of good brigade, and I can explain that. But that's what I think doesn't matter. Historically, Jimmy Carter crashed on the shoals of what was of stagflation, and this country has a wild aversion to quickly rising prices that they can notice and pay attention to. I mean, the fact is, inflation, real inflation, has been 10, 11, 12% for years when you consider what people actually buy instead of the theoretical grocery basket of goods. I mean, when you count energy and housing in the proportions that people really pay, like economists do not look at the official inflation rate, which has been hovering around 1% for years. But people see gas prices go up. That's something they literally see as they drive to work every day, and they feel it. Actually, you can try to explain all you want, which is, look, periods of inflation, as long as things don't get out of control, are good for workers. They tend to correlate to labor shortages and times when workers can really pressure employers for higher wages and improved benefits. And that did happen in the late 1970s. That was part of the story that got buried, but the Republicans were able to to saddle Carter with that burden, and it really helped hobble him that in the Iran crisis.
But wasn't the 70s? I mean, not just the oil crisis, but sort of slow recession and stagflation, and this is more an economics conversation of whether we could employ the same tactics we employed in the 70s to get out of that mess, as that we can, whether we can do that at this point. But either way, there were major downsides to it too, right?
There are major downsides to it. And look, there are a lot. I think clearly monetary policy, the Fed has lots of tools available to it, much more so to deal with, it's harder for them to stimulate the economy than it is for them to slow it down. They can slow it down, but of course that carries its own risks too. Reagan did that, and then that precipitated a major recession in the early 80s. So, and obviously it's a different world now. That was basically almost half a century ago. A lot of things are different, but it's just that so much of the political memory of this country is actually tied into that era, right? I mean, we still don't have diplomatic relations with Iran from something that happened in 1979. So it's potent, and the White House has to be aware of that. But I don't really know that there's much they can do about it. I mean, after all, coming out of the pandemic, they were going to have to stimulate the economy, and that was going to cause some inflation. It was kind of inevitable. And right now it doesn't matter that much because savings are at record rates, and with the supply chain problem, people can't even spend their savings.
Well, a think it does matter. I mean, especially the people who are on the lower end of the income scale. I mean, if you are, half of the country is near poverty. I think it was something to that effect. I don't remember the exact numbers, but roughly half. I mean, over, 60% of the population don't have $500 in the bank. And if you're thinking of the increase in food, increase in gas, these kind of supply shortages, those things do hit people at the bottom of the income scale, as opposed to people who are, let's say, in a stronger middle-class position that would have a hard time paying for it. It seems that Biden, this is something else that's being taken out on Biden. I mean, is it, and I guess maybe there's two questions with that. Is it fair that it's taken out on Biden in this case? I mean, he's the president, so, at the end of the day, the buck stops with him. And what could he even do about it in the first place? I mean, he's trying to argue that the Build Back Better plan or that the infrastructure bill is the thing that will get rid of inflation, even though I'm not quite sure why he thinks that.
I'm not sure why he thinks that either. And you're right, Jamarl. Look, obviously, this impacts people every single day, millions and millions of them. Not to mention also the eviction crisis, and there's a looming foreclosure crisis that people aren't really focused on. But obviously, the people who are losing their homes are focused on it. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know how Build Back Better how that fights inflation. I think the only thing that fights inflation is the Fed, and that tool is available to them. Interest rates are very low. They have a lot of room to raise them and slow down the stock market. But then the stock market starts to go down. There's always, it's so hard to do these nip and tucks. I don't know that I think it is fair in that he wanted this job, he got this job, he has control of the House and the Senate, barely. He can do what he wants as long as he keeps his coalition together. So we kind of come full circle. But it's fair. I mean, the American people have the right to demand accountability from their leaders. Of course, it's fair.
Another thing, Ted, just briefly, just because we talked about this going to the segment with you and you might have heard a bit, have you been paying any attention to this Kyle Rittenhouse trial?
Sorry, to the what?
The Kyle Rittenhouse trial, the ongoing, sort of large, getting publicity, Kenosha, Wisconsin trial, this guy who killed 2, injured 1, Kyle Rittenhouse.
I have not been following it in detail.
That's okay. I'm kind of curious about this just because I'm curious, people on the left, people on the right, who's following it, who's not, no worries. It's an interesting thing. We weren't planning on talking about it again, just taking a brief poll.
Yeah. It was, this was the kid that basically crossed from Illinois to Wisconsin, killed 2, injured 1. The trial is basically taking place right now. So there's a lot of attention focused on the trial just because it's, it's like what's going to happen in this particular situation, and is he going to be held accountable for the killing? Or, and like Shane was mentioning, some very awkward testimony for the prosecution yesterday of having to basically grapple with when he pulled out the gun, when he shot people and everything else. It's somewhat of a complicated trial. But Ted, from your standpoint, what do you think is going to happen here with the Biden administration going forward? I mean, do you think that it's a wrap? It's done? I mean, looking at the polling thing, it's right here. It says the party with a president with an approval rating that dipped below 50% faces a blowout. In 2017 midterms, when Trump's approval rating was 37%, Republicans lost 41 House seats. In 1994 midterms, when Bill Clinton approval was at 48%, Democrats lost 54 seats. And so they're basically saying, not only is Biden unlikable, not only does more than roughly half of the country not want him to run again, the number that's basically higher than Trump's, or for that matter, Kamala Harris is even worse. And so it's not even something where they could say, okay, well, just let the vice president do it. Well, the vice president is less polling than the president. It just seems like they're screwed. And I don't necessarily see how you right the ship on this. And by the way, the debt ceiling is coming up. And if they do something where they pass Build Back Better before dealing with the debt ceiling, well, I don't even know how they're going to raise the debt ceiling. I mean, if we're talking about budget reconciliation, where they're basically using budget reconciliation in order to raise the debt ceiling, well, what happens if they use budget reconciliation twice already? Are they going to be able to use it a third time in December when this basic bill is coming due? It just seems that his presidency is going to be mired with difficulty going forward, just like it was over the past year.
We talked about Jimmy Carter earlier. It does kind of feel like 1978.
Yeah.
Everything sort of just got worse and worse and worse, leading into his defeat. I guess getting clobbered in the primaries by Ted Kennedy, and then going into a general election gravely wounded and losing in a landslide to Ronald Reagan in 1980. I agree, Jamarl. I think there's. I don't see how he can right this ship. I mean, I guess my advice would be to try to nationalize this election with an affirmative sort of Newt Gingrich-like contract on America kind of, with America, sorry. I used to call it the contract on America kind of thing where you sort of nationalize the election. You don't make it defensive. You don't say, beware of the scary Republicans. You say, this is what the Democratic Party has planned. These are the 5 or 3 or 10 planks that every congressman and senator running for election or re-election promises to get behind, and this is what we have planned for the next 2 years. Something like that. But, that's not the Democratic way. They don't do that. They never have. So I don't even know if it would work, but it would kind of be a Hail Mary pass. But I think that would be the direction I would look at.
Yeah, basically, we're going to get things done. Here are the policies we stand by. Put more of us in office, and this is what we're going to do. We promise, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, and not to mention, the problem is Biden had made those promises. He gets in office and doesn't do those things. And then doesn't even seem like he had the party itself to even back him to try to attempt to do those things. Like you say, he's negotiating himself down at this point. Ted, thanks, my man. I really appreciate this conversation. I agree with you. I just don't see what he does. And to make it worse, I don't even see who comes on the other side of Biden. Because it's not like Kamala Harris is going to be somebody who the public is going to approve of. And with so many people basically saying they don't want Biden to even run again, okay, if Biden doesn't run, who is going to run? Who is the Democrats going to put their faith into? 30 seconds, Ted. I'm curious if you have an answer for that one.
They have no choice. They have to go with Harris, even though she's a terrible candidate, and even though she underperformed badly. She never even made it to the Iowa caucus, right, last time. She dropped out before him, like a month and a half before him. It has to be Harris, though, because if the sitting vice president is so unpopular under a president who himself isn't able to run again because he's too old, then, I mean, you don't have anything, right? They have to go through this.
Wow. The voice that you guys were listening to is Ted Rall. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his cartoons and articles at rall.com. Ted, thanks, my man. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show by any means necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about the situation in Ethiopia as insurgents, the TPLF insurgents, are making their way towards Addis Ababa. We're joined in the studio by Bob Schlehuber, who was in Ethiopia just last week. He's back in D.C. at this point. Bob, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, I'm good. It's nice to be back. It was one of those weird trips because you leave late Sunday night from Addis Ababa, like 11 p.m., and somehow you're on a plane for 17 hours, but you arrive in Washington, D.C. at like 7 a.m. Monday. And so it's like, where did all the time go? And how am I still? And it was an interesting trip because we were talking a little bit about, I was in Addis Ababa and outside my window starting at like 6, 7 in the morning on Sunday. I don't know who gets up and protest at 6, 7 in the morning, but people in Ethiopia do. And they were just committed to go out there and be heard that they do not want this war. They do not want violence. They want the country to unite and come together. There is no animosity towards the Ethiopians that live in Tigray. You know, it's pitched as everybody hates the Tigrayans. That's not how it's like Iowans versus like Minnesotans. Like, no, we're all Americans kind of thing. It's like, we don't see these people as part of something else. There are people, we don't want them to be a part of this conflict. We don't want to fight. We want the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, to stop their march towards Addis Ababa immediately, and then to come back here as that weird, bizarre short trip to get back here, and then we come back to the White House with thousands of people, Ethiopians from across the DMV, joining in front of the White House, calling Joe Biden to end the sanctions, end the violence, and the support of the TPLF.
Just yesterday. Just yesterday.
Yeah, just yesterday. And as people say, it's West Addis Ababa here in Washington, D.C. It was good, but it was just very loving and moving to be around so many people that are in a position where they are so hopeful for their future, but watching that hopefulness disappear or dissipate or be challenged in a really real way. And to be in the country right now, you can feel something special about Ethiopia, ready to turn the corner, ready to power up with the grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, ready to think of themselves as one people and to have a quote-unquote, I want to say democracy, and that's obviously a loaded word in the context of Western democracy going to Africa and being in Ethiopia, but a more communal society right now that is ready to kind of turn this corner and to watch the Western world in its support of the TPLF, to see the TPLF with its own interests within the country, all challenge that very aggressively. It was just a really fascinating thing to be a part of. I'm really thankful for that trip.
And real briefly, we've got a lot to talk about in terms of specifics, but with this protest yesterday, no outside media covering it.
I don't get it.
No BBC, no CNN, no MSNBC, no Granted. A lot of the signs were hitting BBC and CNN and other outlets on the signs. They're fake news, their coverage, basically the Western-backed coverage backing the TPLF. And that's a lot of what they're pushing back against.
Just the last year, and you look at the last year kind of a media analysis, I hope professors out there and journalist students are studying this moment to understand how media in America has been so corrupted by money and influences like that over a long time now. And I think it's really important to study. And the framing that all of these media outlets were giving before I got there was that the Ethiopian government was committing genocide of the Tigray people, and they were using famine as a tool of war. And while I was there, the day I arrived, Daniel Bekele, who heads the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, came out with a long weighted report and found that was not happening. He had not credible basis for the framing of Western media. And so Western media kind of just says, maybe it's happening. Maybe they're genociding people. I don't know. We don't know. We're not there. We talked to some people. And so it leads you to think that that's what's happening. And then to have these reports come out, and it is just fascinating to watch that while I was there. The
wrong impression. I mean, they're continuously giving wrong impression. I mean, even the start of the conflict. I mean, it was like a year ago. Shane and I was covering it. The TPLF basically launched an attack. And, Western media turns out and says something to the effect of, we're going to put sanctions on Ethiopia. It's like, what are you talking about? Sanctions on Ethiopia? They're responding to an attack that took place on their own home territory. The Ethiopians that I've knew have been very angry at the United States, especially with the sanctions or this threatening of sanctions. This, you need to stop whatever you're doing from the standpoint of politics. You need to stop working with Eritreans. Like, all of this stuff has been very specific and isolated towards Ethiopians, while giving the TPLF basically a pass in all of this. What was their response to that? Because they had to have seen this in Ethiopia.
They're well aware of Western media. Even at the camps I went to of these displaced people, and the opportunity to go and meet and tell their story. And again, it's just one of those things where I was talking to the Amhara state, which just sits northwest of Addis Ababa, and I was talking to the regional communications coordinator for the Amhara state, and I said, well, who else has been here? Because you have to go and register and just say, hey, we're here. I'm going to go do some stories. Like, who else has been here? He's like, Vice News. And I'm just like, I went to Addis Ababa. I got on a 45-minute flight. And I had arranged a translator who picked me up, and I went. It wasn't that hard. It took a while to just get permission, and obviously a lot's going on, a state of emergency. It's very serious what is taking place in the country. But I could get there, and just to realize that these other media outlets just we're not just going there to tell the story. And these stories for, again, kind of the clickbaity journalism of sensational news. This is what Western media eats up, is the suffering of the African child forced to war and famine and stuff like that. And so for that to also be ignored, it's man, these people are this is when it gets real serious. It's kind of cutesy and imperialistic and one problem on the best of days within the Western media. And then on the worst of days, it is this violent, coordinated criminal act that helps keep up the U.S. government and violence around the world. And to see kind of those that play out, it was just a really intense moment. You know, I think a lot about Israel-Palestine and how it's framed within Western media.
This kind of whitewashing.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank goodness, like the Palestinian activists and organizers and people who feel sympathetic towards that cause have made ground over the last 10 years in the United States and have really challenged both the political and social system here, that those voices are heard, for the few voices that make it from Palestinians. And to find that these Ethiopians, Amhara State, Afarians, I mean, you read the Washington Post, they'll basically quote somebody from the TPLF. They'll say, we reached out to the Abiy Ahmed, the Ethiopian government. They just said, we don't want terrorists attacking us. And then it's like 3 quotes from Tigrayans or a TPLF spokesman for a second time. And so you're just like, you can get these. I can give the Washington Post, Declan Walsh and Kara Anna from what they want some contacts. Like I'll give them 20 people they can call just to like balance out the story. It's not that hard.
They don't want it.
They don't care.
They don't want it. And that's where people have to remember, like, these people are really smart. They're wrong. They're unethical. And they're criminal, but they're smart. There is like a strategic focus, I at least believe. I think to purposely leave out all of the voices and the stories that I covered, to do that, you have to do that intentionally. Yeah. And I don't think you accidentally just miss this whole huge part of it. That is like the main story to me.
Incompetence versus malice. That's a classic dichotomy here. It's pretty clearly malice. They're smart. Maybe incompetent in some cases too, but they have the ammunition. They have the backing. They should be able to find this stuff out. Bob, before we came on, we've only got about 5 minutes left, and we've got to be brief with each of these. But you gave a couple of lenses, lenses that you picked up.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking about the dam that you just brought up. Of course, big conflict sort of between Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt. You also brought up the port of Djibouti. You brought up cultural issues. Just briefly in about 4 or 5 minutes. Can you go over, you know, for people who are interested in looking into this story more, areas of investigation, things they might not have heard about?
Yeah, maybe we could just kind of borrow from the frame of by any means necessary political, social, and economic movements within the country. I think political, it is this interesting transition to go from the Tigray People's Liberation Front that ruled the country for 27 years through kind of an autocracy, a single party rule, something that Barack Obama in 2015 had called the best democracy in Ethiopia. And for them to transition out of that into hopefully what is more of a pluralistic kind of democratically, maybe not necessarily Western democracy, but how people communicate, how they think about sharing resources, how they think about the collective. I think that politically is really interesting, and how it balances kind of our Western institutional ideas and how it within Ethiopia, though, on culture, who it's been divided through ethnicity. I mean, that was the government of the TPLF, was to think about all the different ethnic groups. And I went to this park in Addis that's being built called Unity Park, and it was just beautiful. They have all these steps, and on the steps have all the different, like, dozens, hundred of different ethnic groups within Ethiopia. To think of it just as like one country, and it's beautiful. And you see like Tigray on there, Tigrayan. You know, like these people are part of this. This isn't a separate thing, and this is kind of the TPLF mindset. Is like we're the Tigray state. We want power. There's like a movement here in DC that I'm not going to talk much about because people have been laughing at it. But it's like 9 people that were like Uber drivers that have now formed a new federation that wants to be like the government in exile here in Washington DC, and they like held a press conference and stuff. There's like 9 people that are like the government in waiting, so when all this hits the fan, they can just like, it's just like, what are you talking about? It's like, that's not the mindset and the framework, and I think the country really politically is evolving that way. Socially, it would have been really interesting. I would have really loved to get to know the people are like the sweetest, nicest, caring people that you could ever imagine socially. And it's interesting to watch, again, the TPLF was very restrictive on business and arts and how society could present itself. And so I got to meet a digital film producer who was really neat and had these like really cool ideas about cinema and movie and like a garden walk and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting to see how the country kind of breaks and thinks about itself creatively. I thought one anecdote, which I just think is interesting culturally, is that the boys there in the country and men, they're so affectionate towards each other. Like they hold hands and they like hug and like just very on top of each other. It's like a very special thing to see, especially in America, where it's like, you're being gay. Like, don't touch them. That's not manly. You can't touch your friends. But they're very, I think there's a strong sense of homophobia within the country. And here in some parts of America, you could be openly gay, which is not the same case within Ethiopia. So it's weird because you can't like just touch guy friends, but you can be openly gay. And again, it's where you are, but here in Washington, D.C. at least. Or in Ethiopia, it's like you can touch and hold hands and like be very close to male friends. Nobody thinks, but you can't really be gay. Like it's just an interesting, cultural, social difference. And then economically, I mean, we talked about foreign direct investments over the last 8 years. China has surpassed the United States within the area. The Djibouti port, as we mentioned, that trade route, the larger relationship the United States has with Egypt, and that's both within the country and the region.
Djibouti, just briefly pausing on this, Ethiopia, landlocked country, Djibouti, their main port is through Djibouti, basically. And I remember Djibouti, a big mainstay in the Belt and Road conversation because of China's investment. So partly an investment maybe in Ethiopia, it can be seen that way.
And I think that's the United States' big struggle right now is U.S. imperialism and this idea that we just go to other countries, we dictate the terms and conditions, we take resources, we do what benefits us, and then we leave, being challenged by countries like, and if they're working in their own self-interest, I think they're doing it in a better self-interest.
Yes.
Places like China who are coming in and investing in both parks, like I talked about. I mean, you drive everywhere, you say, like, in partnership with China. So just kind of like the landscape development, again, it's in their own social, like, self-interest, but it's in a country's self-interest to be generous and friendly and kind with those that they're working with. And so to watch the investments in manufacturing and other things, you're seeing the U.S. really get passed by. And I think that's what we're seeing, and it's kind of a ripple effect to the broader, like Afghanistan and stuff, is the U.S. is really struggling. I don't know if you guys noticed this. I caught some of the domestic news on how the Democrats fared while I was gone. And so just to hear it and to be like, I don't think they're doing good internationally either.
You were in Ethiopia, I think, at the time, but of course the Virginia win for Republicans partly swung by Ethiopians.
No, absolutely.
And some of the signs at the protest, I'm sure you saw people saying, well, we'll do it again, that kind of thing. Bob, great reporting.
Thank you.
I'm glad you had a good trip in Ethiopia. Fantastic reporting while you were there. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Appreciate it. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bob Schlehuber is a Sputnik News analyst and host/co-host of Political Misfits with Bob Schlehuber and Michelle Whitty. Listen to that show on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern. Also follow Political Misfits on Twitter at Sputnik Misfits. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this morning show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show in America. That's this one, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Alrighty, good morning, everybody. It's just past 9 a.m. Eastern. It is November 9th this morning, and it's time now for our third batch of headlines. Let's get into them. First up in COVID news. Yesterday in the United States, there were 126,461 new COVID cases reported. There were also 1,222 new deaths reported in the U.S. Over the past week, we've seen an average of about 73,875 cases per day. That's an increase of 5% from the average 2 weeks ago. And again, after decreasing for a while, we stabilized yesterday, and now the number of cases is increasing again. 58% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 67% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 46,575,792 people across the United States. It's killed 755,273 people. In Russia, deaths from the novel coronavirus have reached a daily record of 1,211. That's the country's highest death toll yet in the pandemic. It's also literally one death fewer than the death toll the United States had yesterday, although Russia as a country has a population significantly lower than half of that of the United States. So much more serious cases they're dealing with right now in terms of deaths, sad to say. In national news, back here in the U.S., the Justice Department yesterday argued that the federal government had the authority to mandate that employers require that employees be vaccinated. This came in the form of a 28-page filing before the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which blocked the vaccine mandate last week. Organizers for the Day N Music Festival announced late Monday, yesterday, that rapper Travis Scott will no longer perform at this weekend's event in Las Vegas. That follows the deadly crowd surge at Houston's Astroworld Festival. Investigators are still working to determine all possible causes of death and injuries to the scores of concertgoers who were either injured or who died. They're particularly investigating whether a batch of counterfeit pills possibly laced with fentanyl played a role. An armed paramedic who was shot by Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin last year testified Monday that he pulled out his own firearm because he believed Rittenhouse was an active shooter. Gage Grosskreutz testified that he had unholstered his handgun on August 25th, 2020, as he and a crowd followed Rittenhouse, who had just fatally shot another man. Rittenhouse fell to the ground, fired twice at an unknown person, and then fatally shot Anthony Huber. In international news, a new Chinese aircraft carrier with technology nearly equaling the capabilities of its U.S. counterparts could be launched as soon as February next year. The installation of major external and internal components, including power plants and the aircraft launching system, appears to either be finished or on the verge of completion. Only a few additional items, such as radar and weapon systems, remain to be installed before the vessel can slip into the Yangtze River. Tensions are escalating on the border between Poland and Belarus after Polish officials again accuse their neighbor of helping move migrants toward the frontier and warn that thousands of additional military personnel have been mobilized to respond to confrontations. In the latest in a weeks-long migration crisis at the border, the head of the Polish border guard said that groups of people were attempting to breach the border on Monday evening. In business news, U.S. industrial giant General Electric will split into 3 companies following years of seeing its stock underperform. The company announced the move on Tuesday. The company will be divided into separate units, one focused on aviation, another focused on healthcare, the third focused on energy. And in terms of holiday news, well, I'll come back to that in just a second. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Pardon me, I had to cough. In terms of holiday news, today is National Fried Chicken Sandwich Day, National Scrapple Day, and World Freedom Day.
World Freedom Day.
And it's funny how often the holidays have something to do with food. Like pretty much every day there's another food holiday. Like every food is loved by somebody. So today is Fried Chicken Sandwich Day nationally, and also Scrapple Day. Now Scrapple...
Oh, that's disgusting.
You familiar with one?
Yeah. My grandmother used to have it. It's, I never used to see her. I've never seen her cook it, but the package of it is horrendous.
Can you try to explain it to people who have no idea what it is?
I got to be honest, I'm not even entirely sure what it is. It's like meats or something that are, it just used to be this package with like grayish colored stuff in it.
That's right.
That was always in a freezer.
That's right. I just wanted to get that. So here's the here's what it contains.
Yeah.
But just that's what it looks like, and you're right about that. It's a mid-Atlantic food specialty. Pork scraps, buckwheat flour, cornmeal, and spices. So it's a little bit weird, But I guess my point is, anybody who lives in D.C., by and large, you're going to know about this. It's a mid-Atlantic sort of northeasterly sort of thing, served in restaurants around here. Around the world, you might not. Anyway, that's what Scrapple is. Fried chitlins. Yeah, fried chicken sandwiches are hopefully self-explanatory.
Yeah, hopefully, ideally. No, that's wild. People, food is one of the things that kind of allow people to engage with one another, social, everything else. I can kind of see why that would have a large significance in regards to what people eat and how much dedication they give to it. In the case of holidays and stuff.
I want to go back to just briefly the headline that you brought up last hour. Or you not brought up, but you were like, "That's a good headline." Chaos Never Dies Day.
Yeah.
Who creates that holiday?
Chaos Never Dies.
Chaos Never Dies Day, celebrated November 9th. I'm kind of in love with it as far as holidays go, but it's
like Entropy Day.
Exactly. It's just what kind of holiday is that anyway?
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm really glad Bob can give that explanation, because it's hard to get across how Ethiopians are pretty angry at the way the United States has been treating us. And oftentimes, the ones that I've met, they've been very clear that the U.S. is basically using past political allegiances in order to dictate. For God's sake, Abiy Ahmed won the election. And this is after like 30 years of military rule, or, this rule by this organization. And so from the standpoint of Ethiopians, they look at this and say, look, he ended the war with the Eritrea. It's somewhat of a democratic system that basically elected him. And these guys launch a war, and the response of the United States is, hey, you should engage with the people who basically launched the war, who doesn't necessarily care about the fact that the guy was elected. You should engage with those people, and you should stop your own hostilities. It's like, yeah, but let's be very clear on who started this first. And, to me, I never heard them talk in the sense of hatefulness towards the TPLF or Tigrayans. It was really within this context of we're all Ethiopians. I've heard that more times than I can count. We're all Ethiopians. We're all Ethiopians.
Remember we had Teddy on, Tedros Vikramariam.
Yeah, he would say the same thing.
He would very consistently say the same thing speaking about Ethiopia. And he would say it. And it was a very interesting conversation when we'd have it, because there's like this cultural tone to it and this sense of like sorrow about the division. Like
same thing, yeah.
A deep sorrow that you might expect from family members or something like that. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? It's personal in that way. It's personal. But my point is, for Americans, I'm not used to thinking about culture in the sense where it's like, oh, the Scots or the Irish or the Scot-Irish. And you know what I mean? There's like this deep sense of sorrow or whatever. You know, it's a different thing. And I guess my point is, for an American audience, and I don't know how much of our audience is American, but there's another thing going on there culturally in Ethiopia and in a lot of other countries, I'm sure, too.
Yeah, it's like this tribal element associated with it that, yes, different tribe, same country.
On different traditions, I'm sure. It's not even, I don't want to, but like all these different traditions that I'm sure are preserved true to the present day that give you a sense of meaning and all this stuff. My point is, America, a lot has been written about this. We don't have as much of that. And so there's a deeper level to it, too, speaking with people there, where it's like, for the West, to make it all about, these, I don't know, we miss a lot of it. And in making it about the Ethiopian government oppressively pushing back against these rebels, you completely miss the moral dynamic to it that everybody in the country is aware of.
That they get totally, yeah. That they totally get. Yeah, it's unfortunate, man. I mean, just hearing people talk about it. And, you know, it's this notion of, I can't believe the U.S. is doing this. They're basically backing the group that started it. They're threatening us with sanctions. And I remember one woman, she even made the point of saying, look, if you're going, I don't want to start a war with us. If you're going to take the territory and split, then just go. You know, but, you know, there's a deep pain in the sense that we're all Ethiopians and you guys are basically trying to destroy the country in a civil war. It's fascinating. So, yeah, shout out to Bob for basically, you know, taking that trip and giving us heads up on it.
Great reporting.
Yeah.
And very, very factual reporting.
Yeah, he was quite good in doing it. He did a great job.
Not that that's an exception, but it is in terms of the mainstream media. He just was rattling off facts, going through different facts.
And like he says, like the media, there's no way they're doing that mistakenly. Like there's no way they're this radically incompetent where they're, okay, we're going to ignore reality in order to present the image that falls in line with U.S. foreign policy. I mean, even that's weird. Like for them to take a tact like this, that is so outside the bounds of good sense, of objective journalism, if such a thing exists. No, they've seen to take this tact where they've basically taken the U.S. line on it. It doesn't seem to be an independent media on this particular story. And that's kind of the point that Bob was making. He was like, there is no way they're doing this accidentally where they're entirely blowing off this other perspective and this other side of the conversation. Yeah, I agree with him. I mean, it just seems like there's no way they're that radically incompetent. Maybe I just don't believe it, especially if you're going to organize a story and you're organizing the story in a way that it's persistently against Ethiopia in this case.
Very, very interesting signs there yesterday. They were using, just to give we're talking about Ethiopia and also this protest that took place in Washington, D.C. that we mentioned yesterday. I mean, just now in the conversation with Bob when he was on. Big protest. Bunch of people streaming down.
He said thousands of people,
Yeah, thousands of people. I had no idea what was going on, but after leaving the office, just noticed people. Jack and I were walking back to the house and noticed people streaming down the street with Ethiopian flags. And I was like, wait, there's something going on. So we walked down to the White House. Anyway, looking at the signs, a lot of no more is the hashtag they're using. Hashtag no more, just heads up. I see other people using that hashtag too, so I'm not sure that was the best pick on their part. But if you want to support them, that's one way you can find out more about what they're doing.
Yeah.
The signs, a lot of them hitting BBC, hitting CNN. A lot of it's media coverage. A lot of it's they're lying about us. This is fake news. They're lying about us. We're dying. I saw one that was very interesting, and I still haven't completely worked this out. Quote, Ethiopia is not George Floyd's neck.
Wow.
Think about that for a second.
Wow.
Now, what exactly does that mean?
It
could mean a couple of things. But that was like, I saw that sign 5 times all in a group. My point was, a group of people they saw it in a certain way, and they were like, let's say this. You know what I mean? It's just an interesting perspective on it.
Wow, that's a strong statement. I mean, basically, the U.S. is being a cop of the world, and you're trying to subjugate or at the very least kill Ethiopia. I mean, at some level, you can make that case, right? I mean, if the United States is taking a tack that is going to allow the TPLF to either regain power or take power and reinstate some kind of authoritarian government, then you are basically killing Ethiopia in a weird way, or at the very least killing any notion of democratic order in the country itself. I can kind of see where they're coming at that. That's just a strong statement.
It is. What's weird to me about like a bunch of things weird, but one of the main things that's weird to me, Abiy Ahmed, head of Ethiopia, just a couple of years ago was the recipient of a Nobel Peace Prize. So, and I brought this up this is like the third time or something. I keep hammering on it, and I don't know what to do with it. But my point is, the Nobel Committee seems to me to be a pretty good representative of where the Western establishment is at on people and things. You know, giving Barack Obama the Nobel Peace Prize. You know what I mean?
They hate Bush and they just want to,
you know, it's this larger machine, and I'm not saying everything works together. My point is, the point being there, if they're giving it to Abiy Ahmed, the West liked him at that point, right? The West was like, hey, you know, you handled this transition really well. So what happened? Because if you look at the facts on the ground, it seems like the TPLF, yes, was quite tyrannical. They are a socialist, separatist movement, not the kind of group you'd naturally expect the United States to want to back. Right. What are we getting out of this necessarily? Like, why did we sing Abiy Ahmed's praises when it came in? And maybe I don't want to overstate it too much, but he got the Nobel Peace Prize. My guess is the U.S. was okay with that.
Yeah. And the problem is democracies are messy. And if you have a situation where somebody is an authoritarian leader, I mean, this is what our policy in South America, where despite all of these proclamations of, oh, democracies, we love democracies, we love democracies, at the end of the day, if you had a strong man in office, that strong man can sell you equipment, that strong man can engage your military intelligence services, that strong man doesn't necessarily have to get community approval. They just make a choice in what they're doing. And, you know, I don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of the relationship between the United States and the TPLF, but you heard Bob in the way that they were saying this authoritarian government was somehow a democracy and all this other stuff, basically the way that the U.S. was lying in their relation or their explanation of what Ethiopia is. We used to do the same thing in South America. It was like, oh, this is a great guy. Same thing with Iran, if I'm not mistaken, with the guy who was basically running Iran with the Iron Fist. And so it's like we do this where we bolster these people's credibility despite the fact that what's taking place in those countries are often ghastly. It's just our association with them that we like. Whatever the TPLF was giving the United States in regards to camaraderie or intelligence or personnel for whatever particular thing they were working on, they clearly prefer that over having the messiness of a democracy that may say, yeah, no, we don't necessarily want to go a particular route. That's what it seems to be. At least that's what it often is in other countries in the past when we were pushing for those authoritarian leaders to be head of that country. But I don't know. I don't know the specific details about what the TPLF gives the United States, where the United States would kind of want that back.
And that's the thing, is if I could see at least two angles. One that came to mind last week when we were talking with Bob about it, which is that the TPLF has a think tank wing in Washington and therefore simply is able to exert influence in a way that maybe Abiy Ahmed's government hasn't been able to. Yeah. I could criticize that, but I don't know enough to criticize it. So that's all just
30 years in power, basically.
That's an interesting argument. But that sort of treats the State Department as if it's just, susceptible to any influence that comes in, as if it doesn't have its own motivations, as if there isn't something else at play here. And another reason why they might be doing this, and one that comes to mind, is maybe Belt and Road investments in Djibouti. Wonder how Ethiopia's government stands on that. Another line to investigate, you know what I mean? In the pushback against China, maybe we want to reinsert again, speculation, maybe we want to reinsert the TPLF so that we can have our guy in control of the region, do what we want, push back against China, that kind of thing. Anyway,
if you leave it up to Abiy Ahmed, well, Abiy Ahmed is probably going to go, what's the best interest for me politically and the country politically? And that will most likely be China.
Exactly. That's kind of where my mind goes too. But I don't know. We got to close this segment out, though. We have our guest on the line. We'll be coming back with John Kiriakou, former CIA agent, also host on this network of The Backstory. We're going to be talking about Peter Strzok. Jamarl, in his monologue this morning, talking about Peter Strzok's his appearance on the Rachel Maddow show. Peter Strzok, remember, key FBI agent, also head of counter-intel for the FBI for a while there, and one of the central people in the Russiagate scandal. And his appearance on Rachel Maddow just a couple of days ago. We're also going to be talking about the Supreme Court hearing this case on state secrets coming out of SoCal, with the FBI spying on Muslims in SoCal using this physical therapist that they put up to the task. It's an interesting story, but in terms of the ramifications of the case the Supreme Court is hearing, it's big. We're going to hit it when we come back with John. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. And as Shane mentioned, I did start my monologue off with Peter Strzok. It was a shocking watch to basically see this guy double down on Rachel Maddow, conspiracy theorist in chief for MSNBC, to basically double down on the reporting where it was clear that you had Sussman and Danchenko that basically lied to the FBI. And I make the point that the reason they lied to the FBI is intrinsically linked to their objectives and what they wanted to accomplish. Meaning, if they would have told the truth, it would have undermined their ability to injure Donald Trump or to get an investigation on Trump, or for that matter, get Trump locked up. And that's the reason they lied. Now, Strzok, in his statement, was trying to basically soft pedal that, basically saying, well, look, it is a big deal to lie to the FBI. However, this is like a talking crime. And, you know, maybe we shouldn't be using resources in this particular way. Basically trying to say that Durham, thank you. That Durham was basically going too far in this and trying to set an image that wasn't necessarily indicative of the truth. No, what was true is that these guys were trying to find a way to undermine Trump, to at the very least get Trump locked up, or to allow Hillary Clinton to get over the finish line. And they were willing to lie to the FBI to do it. And Strzok, disgraced former FBI agent that he is basically trying to cover his own tail. To have a conversation about Peter Strzok, this is going to be a great conversation because this person has a relationship, or at the very least has interactions with Peter Strzok that are pretty fascinating, actually. I'm talking about John Kiriakou. He's a former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. John, thank you for joining us on this one.
My pleasure. Good morning.
Good morning. So Peter Strzok goes on Rachel Maddow, and Rachel Maddow is basically trying, I guess, to reinvigorate her credibility and is trying to almost like appease her audience. Yes, I know I've lied to you about this for the last 4 years, but here's Peter Strzok. Here's the disgraced agent that was sleeping around on his wife, that got Hillary Clinton off, but was definitely trying to go after Donald Trump and wrote the book talking about Donald Trump against America. His statements were ludicrous. He was basically doubling down on the Russiagate stuff. What was your thought about it? I'm pretty sure you've seen the conversation that he had basically with Rachel Maddow. What was your take on Strzok, meaning that conversation in general, but also on Strzok as an individual? Because apparently you have history with Peter Strzok.
I do have a history with Peter Strzok. You know, I watched this clip from Rachel Maddow at least 3 times. Just because the first time I saw it, I thought that perhaps I had misinterpreted Peter Strzok's position. But I didn't misinterpret it. Well, what we have in this clip is Peter Strzok at his hypocritical best. You know, Rachel Maddow, guys, we've come to expect this kind of nonsense from Rachel Maddow. Rachel Maddow put her reputation on the line with Russiagate. Russiagate came out to be exactly the opposite of what she thought it was going to be, and she just doubled down and continued with the narrative. Peter Strzok is doing the same thing so that he can try to rescue his reputation. That's what this comes down to. You're right, Jamarl. This is a guy who got caught cheating on his wife, who got caught taking a position against a presidential candidate and intimating that he was willing to use illegality to keep the president-elect out of office. Peter Strzok's a bad guy. And my position too, and forgive me if this sounds, I don't know, if this sounds a little bit more holier than thou than is appropriate. But if the guy's own wife can't trust him, then how is the country supposed to trust him? Why should we be taking him seriously, especially on this issue where he's humiliated himself and proven that he can't be trusted? So yeah, I'm not a Peter Strzok fan, and what Jamarl was alluding to was way back in 2012 when I was arrested for blowing the whistle on the CIA's torture program. It was Peter Strzok that arrested me. It was Peter Strzok that actually put the cuffs on me, and I didn't even realize that until the Washington Post called me and asked me if I wanted to make a comment on Peter Strzok. This is when he was losing his job at the FBI. And I said, well, what do I know about Peter Strzok other than what I've read in the Post? And the reporter said, no, Peter Strzok's the one who arrested you. He's the one who actually put the cuffs on you. And I said, I thought I recognized that son of a gun. So yeah, I've got no love for Peter Strzok, none whatsoever.
That's very interesting. Well, and that would partly probably be because of he was the head of the counterespionage section, right, with the FBI.
Correct.
And so that would be his direct connection. But another side of this, I have like exactly one frame of reference for understanding the duties and the tendencies of a person filling the role of director of counterespionage, counterintel, that kind of thing, which is CIA, James the Ghost Angleton, James Jesus Angleton, exactly. And the paranoia, but also the need to have this sort of, universal omniscient overview of the organization where you're looking into every corner. You're doing counterespionage.
That's right.
You got to have a handle on things. My point is, Peter Strzok, assuming he's trying to fill that role, would ostensibly be a pretty astute dude who has a grasp on things. And yet, as has been shown by comments he's made repeatedly over the years and the testimony on the Rachel Maddow show, the comments on the Rachel Maddow show a couple of days ago, seems at the very least like he's lying. And at most like he's just lost touch with it. What's your take on that, John?
Yeah. I think you're exactly right, Shane. This is a lot of revisionism that we're seeing here from Peter Strzok. Because the positions that Peter Strzok and Rachel Maddow have taken have been proven conclusively to be wrong. And so rather than admit that they're wrong and move on, they double down. And they just keep repeating the lie over and over and over again with the hope that eventually, if they repeat it enough times, people are going to finally believe them. That's what we're seeing here. With Peter Strzok, there's an added level, though, and that is that the guy's not working. He was literally marched out of the FBI by the arm in shame, and so he's trying to recapture whatever remnants of a career he might have.
I'm curious. Do you think Durham? It's unclear how far wide-reaching Durham investigation is. And, I think Shane mentioned the other day, well, why perp walk the guy? Talking about Danchenko, right? Yeah. Because you didn't have to do that. You could have given him an indictment, et cetera.
This is a minor crime, an accusation of a minor crime.
Well, that's what.
In fact, on the federal sentencing guideline schedule, it's the most minor crime that can be charged in the federal government.
That's kind of my point. So what was the point of that? Was the point of that to kind of indicate there will be more and to put the fear of God and some of the other people that might have been involved? Meaning, do you believe that there are more indictments coming down the pike and the politics or the theater of this was almost like shaking the trees on some level to get people this kind of heads up of how serious he is in going after these crimes?
I'm a little more cynical than that, I think. I think that it's not necessarily that there are more coming. It's that John Durham has wasted years. He has wasted millions and millions of dollars of the taxpayers' money. He's come up with 3 indictments, all for lying to the FBI, which is what are known as process crimes or throwaway felonies. And listen, I tout this book all the time called 3 Felonies a Day, written by Dr. Harvey Silverglade, a professor of law at Harvard University. And Harvey argues that we are so over-criminalized in this country that on the average day, the average American going about his or her normal business creates or commits rather 3 felonies every single day. Well, those are the kinds of felonies that Durham is prosecuting here. Come on, making a false statement? Seriously? With the federal sentencing guideline being 0 months in prison? This is what we've spent millions and millions of dollars on and occupied the time of a dozen attorneys and investigators at the Justice Department. So this is a way for Durham to at least save face, where he can say, well, yeah, I worked for all these years and there was no Russiagate proof, but we got these 3 indictments for lying to the FBI.
So you think he's running for cover?
It's embarrassing.
You think he's running for cover? That
I do. I think that's exactly what it is. Remember, this is the same John Durham that was supposed to have investigated the CIA for the torture program and then decided not to indict anybody at all. So this is very much in keeping with his modus operandi.
Very interesting. So he's the, wow, that's an interesting point. He's not necessarily there to do anything in the sense of like trying to solve it per se. He's there to basically keep down the image of, or to improve or to keep the image of the FBI whole in this case.
I think so. And I really believe it.
We kind of got into this yesterday. I brought this up because I've seen plenty of people speculating on this. But basically the idea is he'll go just far enough to show that, okay, he's done his due diligence, he's done his work, and then he'll back off. Because at the end of the day, he's an institution man, a company man, or whatever. Very
much so.
That kind of thing. Yeah, it's just toying with these theories. It's very interesting to hear because, again, Michael Sussman, when that indictment came out, I was like, okay, is this all? Is that, it's years of this? And Kevin Kleinsmith, admittedly, they were pursuing that earlier, but okay. And then we saw, with Danchenko, that's another beat in the story. Then, of course, there's Charles H. Dolan Jr., and suddenly you're sort of, New York Times has to pivot on it and admit that this is a DNC operation. So there have been some sort of backsteps from the MSM.
Yes.
But again, like you're saying, here's another side of this. Peter Strzok going on Rachel Maddow, when she sends him off and thanks him for coming on, I brought this up earlier, the way that she did it almost made me feel like she's thanking him because he could come under fire, because this could come up if Durham decides to push charges. And when he's saying, during his appearance, when Peter Strzok is saying basically, we weren't investigating the Trump campaign. That wasn't ever a thing, despite Crossfire Hurricane and what we all know there. It seems like he's trying to set up a legal defense. And it seems like Maddow recognizes that he could face prosecution. Do you think he's off-base in thinking that? In other words, is he more worried about Durham than he should be? Or am I missing something there, John?
No, I don't think that he faces prosecution anymore. To tell you the truth, and I have my own biases, I was very much hoping that he would be prosecuted under the Trump administration. But now I think we've gotten to the point, we've gotten far enough away from Russiagate that I think it's just not worth the Justice Department's time and effort to prosecute, besides the fact that we've got to be bumping up against the statute of limitations by now. His actions, or the actions for which he was fired, were 4 years ago, and the statute of limitations on these low-level felonies is 5 years. So if we're going to prosecute Peter Strzok, it's got to be right quick, because I think time's just about out.
It's just what he's been accused of had such dramatic consequences. Like, for example, the Hillary Clinton one. Peter Strzok was the one that was instrumental in ensuring Hillary Clinton didn't get locked up. I mean, yes, Comey was the main person on it, but he basically watered down the language in the Clinton case from grossly negligent, which was a crime, to extremely careless, which was not. I mean,
that's right.
You basically had Comey coming out saying Hillary Clinton did all of this stuff and, enumerating it one after the next, even making the point of saying, yes, foreign actors have their hands on her technology and her information. She was the president's wife. She should have known better. She was the vice secretary of state. She should have known better. And yet, no crime, despite the fact that they put people in prison for less. I mean, astonishing stuff. And then, so Strzok comes from that investigation after saving Hillary Clinton on the investigation with Trump, where he basically goes after Trump while at the same token browbeating the guy. Meaning he's investigating him and talking trash about the person that he's investigating. I mean, astonishing stuff. I mean, I guess my thought is the consequences of it were so dramatic for the last 3 or 4 years, where they basically went after a sitting president over something that was a psyop. or the entire public.
If this doesn't show us or show Americans that the fix is in Washington, I don't know what would show that. Because here we've got crimes that were essentially laid bare on the television news every night, and the Justice Department doesn't seem to care.
I agree with you on this. I want to play one of the clips from Rachel Maddow. Let's play this first one. I want to get your take on what he's saying here.
And so let me be clear. Lying to the FBI is a significant crime. It's a crime if the National Security Advisor does it. It's a crime if, as alleged, Mr. Danchenko did that during his interviews with FBI agents. As you mentioned earlier, I have some concerns with the indictment of Michael Sussman. I'm concerned about whether or not that's a good use of government resources to charge him. But at the end of the day, it is a crime to lie to the FBI. But what isn't true is the backdrop to all this. You know, in next Saturday, John Durham will have been going on for 2.5 years. Now, compare that to Robert Mueller, who lasted less than 2 years, and in that time, charged and convicted people like Trump's national security advisor, his campaign manager, his deputy campaign manager, his personal attorney, his, personal Roger Stone, personal fixer, and a large number of very significant people that were key and critical to the Trump campaign and later to the administration. When I look at these two players, I see folks that were not involved in any of those cases. You know, Robert Mueller didn't rely on Steele's information at all. The Alpha Bank information, was looked at by the FBI and was determined to be not, didn't appear to be anything, that we weren't quite sure what it was. And then finally, with regard to, Mr. Danchenko's information, it was relevant to Carter Page, but Carter Page made up about 8 pages of an almost 500-page Mueller report.
Let's stop right there for a moment.
So my worry is that as Americans...
So they spied on Carter Page, not just spied on him, they even lied in order to create FISA warrants after the fact, even when they found out the guy was basically an informant for the CIA. And this was their basically end to the Trump administration. Comment on that for a moment. I mean, he's trying to basically argue, well, we weren't able, even though the FBI couldn't necessarily pin Trump down on this stuff, well, we couldn't exclude him from it either. I find it to be somewhat ludicrous. What are your thoughts?
Out of all the injustices that we've seen in this Russiagate case, I think the greatest injustice was to Carter Page. I've spoken to him about this. Carter Page was a nobody who really wanted to be a somebody. And he thought that he could become a somebody by joining the Trump campaign. Well, he professed a certain level of expertise on Russian issues, and specifically Russian energy and economic issues. And he marketed himself to the Trump campaign as the kind of expert who could advise the campaign in its battle against these foreign policy experts that made up the Clinton campaign. And for whatever reason, the FBI decided that Carter Page was a spy for the Russians. And he wasn't. He was a patriotic American. So they went to the FISA court and they got a FISA warrant against him as a threat to national security. And then when they realized that there was nothing illegal happening, that Carter Page wasn't spying for the Russians, they went back 3 more times to the FISA court and got more permission to spy on him. So why haven't those FBI agents been prosecuted? Why is, for example, Sussman being prosecuted, or Danchenko, or however you say his name? Why are these guys being prosecuted, again, for the most minor crimes that can be charged in the federal government, making a false statement, but the people who ruined Carter Page's life are still going to work every day and doing their jobs?
Valid question. Valid question, and one that I think anybody who's defending what Durham is doing here sort of reflexively would need to answer. John, let's pivot here. We've got about 10 minutes left with you. I wanted to get to the Supreme Court case involving FBI surveillance of a Muslim community in Southern California yesterday. Yes. They started to hear this. Basically, a big case, and I'll set this up as far as I understand it. After 9/11, after the start of our war on terror, as all of this stuff was ongoing, clearly the FBI naturally is doing counter-intel programs in the United States, trying to figure out, okay, terror threats. as they do that, they start to indiscriminately target Muslim groups, Muslim communities in the United States, just based on the, their religion, for no, direct affiliation, just because they are Muslims. In Southern California, there's a specific case. They send out an agent, this guy named Craig Monteil, who basically poses as a physical therapist, says he's converting to Islam, and joins a local community. And people in the local community start to get freaked out when this guy, Craig Monteil, later revealed to be an FBI asset, starts trying to encourage people to engage in jihad and do all this dangerous stuff. We've been talking about entrapment with the FBI in context of a couple of things. January 6th, the assassination threats against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, talking about all that stuff. This is back then. Anyway, the local community decides to, hey, this is not cool. You guys are discriminating against us. You're spying on us based solely on our religion. They pursue a legal case against the government. Government in a lower court shuts that down. Now the Supreme Court is hearing this case. And what it hinges on is whether in a lawsuit filed against the government, can you allow that lawsuit to go forward if in the course of having it go forward, national security secrets come out? Again, we're talking about the FBI dealing with some secret stuff. They're doing counterterrorism. I get there are some things they want to keep secret. But here's where it gets big. If the precedent is set by the Supreme Court that lawsuits that could out secret information can't go forward, that seems like an incredibly broad umbrella at a time when I trust the government less than ever. Government could theoretically shut down all sorts of lawsuits against themselves, against them as an institution, as a group of institutions, just based on the hypothetical, maybe this could reveal national security information. Maybe I'm painting with too broad a brush there, John, but is that
No, you're not.
Is that the level
you're
here?
You're not. That's exactly the question here. And the interesting thing to me in this case, this was heard in the Supreme Court on Monday. The interesting thing is that there didn't seem to be any ideological dividing lines here, any partisan dividing lines. The two justices who most severely questioned the government's position on this were Gorsuch and Breyer, a Trump appointee and a Clinton appointee. So this is exactly what the case is, the way you've elucidated it, Shane. You've got a situation where the FBI sends an informant into a mosque, and the informant is spying on everybody, both in person, collecting personal information, and electronically recording conversations that he's carrying out inside the mosque. And then he says to 3 people that he has befriended for the FBI, hey, I have access to explosives and detonators. We should blow something up. And so what did the 3 Muslim targets do? They all 3 go to the FBI and report, there's this crazy guy in our mosque and he's trying to get us to blow things up. Well, the crazy guy is the FBI informant. Now, the crux of the case is the FBI, when they're sued, they go to the district court and they say, national security. And the district court says, oh, got it. Case is dismissed on national security grounds. Well, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said, well, wait a minute. There appears to be some wrongdoing on the part of the FBI here. So the legal question is what happens if it is a national security case, but there is wrongdoing? Does the FBI still get to go into court and argue national security and have it dismissed? So this is what Justice Breyer said on Monday. He said, look, there has to be some sort of mechanism by which a judge can be informed on exactly what it is the FBI is trying to protect. Because in this Orange County case, the FBI just said, well, we can't argue in court because what might be revealed is the actual target of the investigation, implying that the target was not any of these 3 people who were targeted, that there was a 4th target that was the actual target. And so I think that, well, the Washington Post said today that the vote might be close, and we're certainly not going to know what the vote is until probably the first week of June. They were speculating that it could be 5-4, but I think that we're going to see some strange bedfellows in this case because it really is a civil liberties case. Mm-hmm. We need some sort of mechanism by which we can be protected from our own government.
Yeah, this was a conversation we were having yesterday, and I think I made the point, like, you have to know what your government is doing in a representative democracy or a representative government. And, oftentimes they're trying to hide waste, fraud, abuse, or just basically embarrassment, where they use the national security thing as their way of concealing everything else. Well, a judge, if they're going to make any kind of ruling on this, has to have some insight or some heads up into what is taking place. Otherwise, you just have this complete blanket conversation that they can basically apply to anything they don't necessarily want to disclose. I mean, and would this have larger repercussions on things beyond just the way that they're going about this? What are some of the other repercussions?
Great question, Jamarl. And the answer is yes. And I think that's what the FBI is afraid of. What pops into my head almost immediately is the Jeffrey Sterling case. Jeffrey Sterling was a CIA whistleblower who had complained about systemic racism in the promotion process at the CIA, and he was charged with 9 felonies, including 7 counts of espionage, and accused of leaking information to the New York Times, which he adamantly denied. And so Jeffrey decided to go to trial to prove his innocence. And at every step of the way, the government argued national security, to the point where, at the end of the day, Jeffrey was unable to mount a defense for himself. And so I think that's really what the most important issue here is. The FBI is afraid that people are going to be able to use national security information to defend themselves, which they ought to be able to do. All the while, the FBI's position is that even federal judges can't be trusted with the information.
Wow, that's amazing.
Very interesting. But here's the thing. One more thing before we close out, John. I can see why the government would, of course, want to protect national security secrets, and yet it seems to me that there would be a way for them to permit some of that information into the courts in a masked form. How would this stuff work out, and just how should that work, in your opinion? In other words, you know, I understand there are conflicting interests here. We need to have insight into the government, and clearly, if the government does things wrong, we need to be able to seek recourse from it. But on the other hand, it has secrets it wants to protect. What's the sort of reasonable middle ground that you think the government should pursue, John?
Yeah, I think the reasonable middle ground is you're going to have to issue security clearances to judges and attorneys, which is already done in normal, regular cases. Perhaps have a cadre of attorneys who are cleared, who can keep a secret and still represent plaintiffs or defendants in these cases. Because we've already learned that we can't trust the government. We can't trust the government to just say national security, and we're supposed to all take their word for it.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And partly the fact that we're already doing that, I didn't know exactly what you would, of course, what you'd say, but the fact that we're already doing that adds evidence to the side that this case is not legit in some sense. That this case, as the Supreme Court sees it, there are already ways of handling this. And if you add that level of immunity, if you give the government that level of immunity, if you give the FBI, any institution, that level of immunity, it's not good for Americans, but it's also not good for the intelligence community itself, because it sort of lacks this self-reflective mechanism to go, hey, we got this wrong. We've got to improve this.
That's exactly right. And that makes us a weaker country.
Agreed. Yeah. John Kiriakou, great conversation as always. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you. Former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, also an author. Check out his books, including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. Follow him on Twitter at John Kiriakou. Learn more about him at johnkiriakou.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, coming back, taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays, when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Let us go to Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
Thanks for taking my call, gentlemen. First, I'd like to say free Julian Assange, free Donald Trump, and hands off Haiti. I have 3 comments.
Hands off Ethiopia now, too, man. I saw that hashtag out at the protest here in D.C. yesterday. Anyway, go for it, Tarif.
Yeah, Yeah, the Ethiopian thing, that thing is messed up. What's going on over there? But Julian Assange's wife, partner Stella Morris, is trying to marry Julian Assange, and now they're going to sue the British government because they're blocking them from being married. They've been postponing it for some reason. So we got to get behind that and help them out where they can get married. So they got to set up the roadblock, trying to get them not to married. So we got to remove that roadblock. I said the comments dealing with the this man named Peter Dale Scott. He did a book on the Iran-Contra affair, and he was talking about the drug connections and all that, and how it was covered up back in the 80s. How when certain information got out, the people didn't really, for the full scale story of it. I got a little tweet about it. Somebody had tweeted and I retweeted it and I shared it with y'all. His name is Peter Dale Scott. And if somebody can leak some information on that, that would be good on the Iran-Contra affair.
Very interesting. Well, I know that Lee and John actually were just speaking with John Kiriakou, of course, also Lee Stranahan. They're the hosts of The Backstory, also on Radio Sputnik. They actually had Peter Dale Scott on not too long ago. I was talking with Lee about that. So I'll look more into what you were posting on Twitter. Thanks for that, Tarif. And maybe we can get him on too sometime soon. He's 92 years old.
Oh wow,
the guy
that old.
He is old, but of course still astute. As a lot of people who get up there actually are. Anyway, Tarif,
the Iran-Contra affair was fascinating. I mean, the selling of weapons, Congress passing the Bolin Act. This was Congress actually trying to put restraints on presidential power. And Ronald Reagan still went around it and saying, I didn't know what was taking place, even though the buck stops with me. It's a famous video that Ronald Reagan made. Was utterly astonishing.
Yeah.
But basically, Reagan wanted to give money to the groups in South America in order to stop the left-wing movements that were taking place in South America. And because Congress forbade him from doing that, passing the Bolin Act to do it, Ronald Reagan decided to sell weapons or get weapon enemies, Iran, we're considering them an enemy at this point, and using that money so he wouldn't have to appropriate the money for Congress. And so he ships the money basically to South America to go along with it. Oliver North, I think, was the main character in that particular one. And they were having these, this is within my political memory, they were having these meetings over and over and over, the congressional testimony that seemed to go on forever. But yeah, wild stuff. I mean, and these days, you wouldn't think twice about it, right? I mean, you have Obama who would basically put money into a country, spend $1 billion in order to knock over Syria. Back during that time, at the very least, they looked at Reagan like, whoa, what are you doing? Meaning, it's one thing to have this stuff in the shadows. It's another thing for this stuff to come out of the shadows where it's clear that the president was doing something that the president had no business doing, and the American public looked at it and was like, oh, that's ghastly. But it seems that this is another one of those cases where it seems to just get worse. Now, it's understood that the U.S. is doing this stuff, and nobody cares. Nobody looked at Obama weird at all when he dropped $1 billion into Syria to try to topple Assad, getting 500,000 people killed in the process.
Nope.
So, yeah. Tarif, thanks, my man.
In terms of the moral slippery slope or whatever, as the decades have worn on, we've gotten more and more used to the bad things our government does, I'm sad to say.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't even get a eyebrow raise at this point.
No, 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Tarif, thank you for the call. Let's go to Michael calling in from Silver Spring. Michael, you're on. What's on your mind?
Hi. Regarding morality and a lot of the, how things are played out, and I think we should look at, is there a connection between the CIA and the judges? I wanted to ask Mr. Kiriakou that because the judges, even though, publicly the FBI, which I think is connected with the CIA, they may not be able to give judges information that may be admissible, but behind the scenes, I think the judges are completely capable of receiving information anonymously. And just, I think judges in general, regarding presidents and how they act, I think the people that would question the morality would be, the judges. And can we possibly get more familiar with the judges? Because then it's less of a guessing game. No?
You mean, can we get into a situation where the judges get the information? I mean, there are times where judges do get the information.
And then they're given security clearances. That was kind of the last question I asked him. It seems like that already does happen. I was trying to, connections between the CIA and the FBI in terms of influence, not just passing information down, but influencing their decisions. I can speculate, but I've got no clue, so I'm not going to speculate on that one. It would make sense to me that, of course, they would. But I don't know about that. Michael, any other comments here?
Yeah, just the connection between the CIA and the judges.
Yeah, I don't know about that one, man.
Yeah,
I don't have any
that's a hard
insight.
one.
I can speculate, and I can certainly imagine that there's going to be some connection just because people communicate, and if there's political pressure from this big institution as a part of the government, then you can bet that's going to filter down in some way to the courts. But I don't want to think that there's just a complete control. It's undoubtedly not how that works.
And by the way, just in case, I mean, the judge could be prosecuted like anybody else if the judge is handing out information that he got for some kind of top secret stuff. Meaning the argument from the standpoint of should the judge get the privileged information to make a decision on whether or not this is waste, fraud, and abuse, and they don't necessarily want to give up the information just because they don't want to embarrass themselves, or whether it is a state secret. The judge should be able to make that choice. And, just like anybody else who has some kind of security clearance, even if it's temporary, well, you'll prosecute the guy if the guy says anything. And so, it seems like something should be done, and it shouldn't just be up to the FBI or the CIA to be like state secrets. And that's the end of it. No. It's like kills the case. The person can't even defend themselves.
No, especially because there's already a way of dealing with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, Michael, thank you for the call. 202-521-1320 is the phone number if you want to join us. Let's go to Louise calling in from Virginia. Louise, you're on the line. What's on your mind this morning?
Yes, good morning, folks. I'd like to mention and literally spell out the name of a plan that I have not heard mentioned on Sputnik. It's the Yinon plan, Y-I-N-O-N. It goes way back, and it's an Israeli plan for causing dissension everywhere, basically, using ethnic and tribal hatreds. Y-I-N-O-N. I think you all could look it up unless you know about it already, and you could keep talking about it.
You have not heard about it from me on Radio Sputnik because until you mentioned the word and spelled it out, I had not heard of it. And so I just looked it up, and it has a longer Wikipedia article that I plan to go through. It's interesting. But yeah, that's my answer, at least. Jamarl?
Yeah, I've never heard of the word. I mean, but it is somewhat of basic playbook to try to undermine the governments that you're trying to screw with by using whatever tensions that are there. I mean, oftentimes, the secret is, oftentimes, it's not a situation where something is created out of whole cloth. In cases where one government is trying to create something out of whole cloth in order to undermine the other government, that often doesn't necessarily work. It's usually the fractures that are already in the country. So in Syria, we're just talking about that. Well, there were already divisions in the country. There were already protests, and those protests could be pushed for more. In Cuba, when they were trying to use the Twitter app or an app similar to Twitter, basically to inflame political tensions in the country in order to try to undermine the government of Cuba. I mean, it's kind of the playbook. And so I'm not necessarily shocked that Israel has a word for it.
Well, I'm also reminded of colonial rule and the tendency of using a minority caste as the rulers in a local country because it kind of creates this perpetual instability. Where they can't ever permanently consolidate their power because they're not representative of the mass of the population, but they're a useful sort of tool. I don't know. That thing comes to mind. Also, Lebanon and the political structure of Lebanon. Yep. We've talked about Gus with this before. I need to go back for some of the specifics, where basically you have an intensely fractured political system along explicitly sectarian grounds, religious grounds, where basically, as far as I can tell,
it's like there are elements of the government that have to be broken into those groups.
They have to be broken into those groups. And in the process of trying to seek, give representation, at least that's the way they can put it, give representation to all these different groups, you create all these divisions, and it makes it hard for the government to get anything done. So I've heard arguments about that, but I was not familiar with this plan that you brought up, Luis.
Thank you, Luis. Totally appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the call. 202-521-1320 is the phone number if anybody else wants to join us on the line here.
Yeah, really good show today. I always enjoy the conversations with Kariaku. Well, Ted too. Good show today. I enjoyed all their conversations. All of the guys are pretty affable and interesting. Kariaku is always so weird to me, just because oftentimes what he's talking about is stuff that is personal history, but the names that he's using and the names that are being pulled into it are just big. I mean, the fact that we're talking about Peter Strzok and his kind of ignoble career. And then John Kiriakou has a direct meeting with him. Even when we're talking to like Scott and we're getting into like either Colin Powell, we're getting into the weapons of mass destruction stuff. Some of these guys have been actors on the world stage for a while, and they have, a larger influence or larger significance in regards to us being able to talk to them. So, no, it's fascinating conversations, to put it mildly.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Very, very, very good conversation with them. One quick comment here, by the way, folks. It is the week of Veterans Day. And so this Thursday, we're not going to be on the air. I'm going to give you a quick reminder again throughout the show tomorrow. We will be on the air this Friday. So we're just going to be off for this one day. Federal holiday, folks. Anyway, just giving you a heads up. Again, I'll remind you tomorrow. We'll be on tomorrow, but this Wednesday, we're going to be off. Just giving folks a quick heads up on that one. Yeah, I had no idea. We before we talked about it yesterday, that Peter Strzok was the one to put the handcuffs on John Kiriakou. Again, it makes sense. Head of counterespionage for the FBI. I can see a case there.
How weird is that?
But it is weird.
Yeah.
Those weird connections.
And then they called John and saying, hey, you have any comment about Peter Strzok being fired, basically? Because they basically walked him out. I mean, at the point where they found the information showing him basically trashing Donald Trump while investigating Donald Trump. Well, that looks horrendous. Not to mention you're trashing him to your girlfriend, who is also one of the other agents at the organization. And I got to be honest, I mean, for him to be working on Clinton's case and is directly related to Clinton getting off, and then they immediately switch him over to Trump, that looks horrible. That looks absolutely horrible. But yeah, I think the real question is, how far is Durham's investigation going to go?
That's the real question. I hope John's wrong about it.
Yeah.
Just to say it that rationally or whatever, John was saying that, he thinks Durham is going to only go so far, and then he's going to cut it to show that he did his work on it.
Yep.
But he doesn't actually want to do what you would need to do to right the wrongs here, which is a full sort of, gutting, but a real investigation that goes in and finds people in positions of power and outs them. So far, it's been these marginal players, sub-sources, and that kind of thing.
Not a process crimes.
Not the people in charge.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we'll see. Yeah. We'll see what comes of this. We've got to close this show out, folks. We will be back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern, off this Thursday. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you on the other side.